The Capetians gave France its language, its laws, its boundaries, and its very identity as a unified kingdom. For more than 800 years, every king who sat upon the French throne traced his bloodline back to one man, who began not as a conqueror, but as a clever politician in an age of chaos. In the year 987, France as we know it today did not exist. What would become the great kingdom of France was then a patchwork of feudal territories, each ruled by powerful lords who commanded their own armies, minted their own coins, and often wielded more real power than the king himself. The western portion of Charlemagne's once mighty empire had fractured into countless pieces, and the crown of the West Franks, as it was then called, had become almost meaningless. Kings came and went, some from Charlemagne's bloodline, others elected by the great nobles when that ancient line seemed to fail. It was into this world of uncertainty and division that Hugh Capet stepped forward to claim a crown that many thought worthless, and in doing so he would lay the foundation for one of history's most enduring monarchies. Hugh was not born to be king. His family, the Robertians, had long been powerful in the region around Paris, but they were counts and dukes, not kings by blood. His father, Hugh the Great, had been one of the most powerful men in the realm, bearing the title Duke of the Franks and controlling vast estates between the Seine and Loire rivers. When Hugh the Great died in 956, his son inherited not just lands and titles, but also a complex web of alliances and enmities that would shape his path to the throne. The young Hugh Capet, whose surname came from the cape or capa he wore as a lay abbot, proved himself to be a master of the political game that dominated 10th century France. He understood that in a world where might often made right, true power came not just from the sword, but from careful alliance, building, strategic marriages, and above all, patience. For 30 years, he watched and waited as the last Carolingian kings struggled to maintain their authority against increasingly independent nobles. The death of King Louis V in May 987 presented Hugh with his opportunity. Louis died young, leaving no direct heir, and the succession was disputed. There was Charles of Lorraine, uncle of the dead king and a legitimate Carolingian. But Charles had made enemies by accepting vassalage from the German emperor, which many French nobles saw as a betrayal. Hugh moved quickly, securing the support of Adalberon, the influential Archbishop of Reims, and other key church leaders who saw in him a defender of their interests against both aggressive nobles and potential German interference. The election that followed was not democratic in any modern sense, but rather a gathering of the most powerful men in the realm, both secular and religious, who would choose their next king. Hugh's preparation paid off magnificently. On July 3, 987, at Noyon, the assembly chose Hugh Capet as king of the Franks. The Archbishop of Reims performed the sacred coronation, anointing Hugh with holy oil in a ceremony that linked the new king directly to God's will, a connection that would become central to Capetian ideology for centuries to come. But being crowned king and actually ruling as king were very different things in 10th century France. Hugh's direct authority extended little beyond the Île-de-France, the region around Paris. Great dukes like those of Normandy, Burgundy, and Aquitaine ruled their territories with near complete independence, owing the king little more than nominal homage. Some historians have estimated that Hugh directly controlled perhaps only a territory equivalent to 3 or 4 modern French departments, while his theoretical kingdom covered most of what is now France. Hugh understood these limitations and worked within them rather than against them. He did not attempt grand military campaigns to force submission from his powerful vassals. Instead, he focused on securing what he had and ensuring the continuation of his dynasty. In a masterstroke of political planning, he arranged for his son Robert to be crowned as co-king while he himself still lived, a practice that would become standard for early Capetian kings and would prove crucial in establishing the hereditary principle of succession. This association of the heir to the throne was revolutionary in its implications. The Frankish crown had been elective, at least in theory, with the great nobles choosing each new king. By having Robert crowned while he still lived, Hugh created a fait accompli. When he died, there would already be an anointed king on the throne, making any election merely a formality. This simple but brilliant strategy would be followed by Hugh's successors for 2 centuries, gradually transforming the French monarchy from an elective to a hereditary institution. The early years of Hugh's reign were marked by careful consolidation rather than dramatic expansion. He faced several challenges to his authority, including a serious revolt by Charles of Lorraine, who had not given up his claim to the throne. The conflict dragged on for years, with Charles capturing Laon and Reims, 2 of the most important cities in the kingdom. Hugh's response showed his pragmatic nature. Rather than engaging in costly military campaigns he could ill afford, he used diplomacy, bribery, and patience to wear down his opponent's support. When Charles was finally betrayed and captured in 991, Hugh showed mercy rather than vengeance, imprisoning but not executing his rival. Hugh's relationship with the church proved to be one of his greatest assets. The French clergy, particularly the powerful monasteries, saw in the Capetian monarchy a protector against the depredations of lawless nobles and a supporter of church reform movements. Hugh cultivated these relationships carefully, granting charters to monasteries, supporting the Peace of God movement that sought to limit violence against non-combatants, and presenting himself as a Christian king ruling by divine right. The concept of sacred kingship that Hugh embraced would become fundamental to Capetian ideology. The king was not merely a political leader, but God's chosen representative on earth, anointed with holy oil and possessed of sacred powers. This religious dimension of monarchy provided the Capetians with a source of authority that transcended mere military might or political manoeuvring. Even when Capetian kings were weak in practical terms, they retained a sacred aura that set them apart from even the most powerful nobles. Hugh's reign also saw the beginning of what would become a distinctive Capetian administrative style. Unlike the Carolingians, who had attempted to rule through a complex system of counts and missi dominici spread across the entire realm, Hugh focused on developing effective governance within his limited domain. He appointed prévots to administer royal estates, established a rudimentary chancery to handle correspondence and record-keeping, and began the slow process of creating a professional royal administration. The economic foundations of Capetian power were modest but solid. The royal domain, centred on Paris and Orleans, included some of the most fertile agricultural land in France. The Seine River provided a vital commercial artery, and Paris, though far smaller than it would later become, was already an important trading centre. Hugh and his successors would carefully nurture these economic resources, understanding that financial strength was essential to political power. When Hugh Capet died on October 24, 996, he left behind a kingdom that was small and weak by the standards of his Carolingian predecessors, but one with foundations that would prove remarkably durable. His son Robert II succeeded him smoothly, the first peaceful hereditary succession in the Capetian line. This quiet transfer of power might have seemed unremarkable at the time, but it marked the beginning of an extraordinary continuity. For the next 341 years, son would follow father on the French throne in an unbroken line of succession, a record unmatched in European history. Robert II, known as the Pious for his devotion to the Church, faced challenges that would have destroyed a weaker dynasty. His reign began with a serious crisis when he decided to marry Bertha of Burgundy, who was his cousin within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. The Church's opposition was fierce, and Pope Gregory V excommunicated the king, placing the entire kingdom under interdict. This meant that no religious services could be performed, no Christian burials could take place, and the king himself was, theoretically, cut off from salvation. The crisis revealed both the weakness and the strength of the early Capetian monarchy. Robert could not simply ignore the Church's opposition, as a more powerful ruler might have done, but the resolution of the crisis also showed that the Capetian kings had become essential to the Church's vision of Christian order in France. After years of negotiation and penance, Robert separated from Bertha and married Constance of Arles, restoring his relationship with the papacy and reinforcing the alliance between throne and altar that Hugh had established. Robert's long reign of 35 years saw the slow but steady growth of royal authority. He was not a great warrior king, but he was an effective administrator and a patron of learning and the arts. The royal court under Robert became a centre of scholarship and religious devotion, attracting clerics and intellectuals from across Europe. The king himself was literate, unusual for a layman of his time, and was said to have composed hymns and religious poetry. The development of royal justice under Robert marked an important step in the growth of monarchical power. While the king could not impose his will on the great duchies and counties, within the royal domain he began to establish the principle that the king's justice was supreme. Royal courts started to hear appeals from seigneurial courts, and the king's peace began to extend beyond his immediate presence. These were small steps, but they established precedents that later Capetian kings would build upon. Robert's reign also saw the beginning of what would become a characteristic Capetian policy: the patient accumulation of territory through marriage, inheritance, and purchase rather than conquest. When the Count of Dreux died without heirs, Robert successfully claimed the county for the crown. When the opportunity arose to acquire the county of Melon, he took it. These acquisitions were modest, adding perhaps a few hundred square miles to the royal domain, but they established a pattern that would continue for centuries. The question of succession that had been so smoothly resolved at Hugh's death became more complicated under Robert. The king had 3 sons who survived to adulthood, and there was no clear law establishing which should inherit. Robert initially favoured his eldest son, Hugh, and had him crowned as co-king in 1017, but Hugh died in 1025, and Robert then faced a choice between his 2 remaining sons, Henry and Robert. The succession crisis that followed Robert II's death in 1031 showed that the Capetian dynasty, while established, was not yet secure. The war between the brothers lasted 3 years, with Henry ultimately prevailing and Robert receiving the Duchy of Burgundy as compensation. This division of the inheritance would have important long-term consequences, creating a cadet branch of the Capetian family that would sometimes support and sometimes challenge the senior line. But Henry VI's victory also reinforced the principle of primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son should inherit the crown intact rather than dividing the kingdom among all sons as had been Frankish custom. Henry VII's reign, from 1031 to 1060, has often been portrayed as a period of weakness and decline for the Capetian monarchy, but this assessment misses important developments that would prove crucial for the dynasty's future. Yes, Henry faced serious challenges, including the rising power of his nominal vassals, particularly William, Duke of Normandy, who would conquer England in 1066. But Henry also continued the patient work of consolidation and administration that characterized early Capetian rule. One of Henry's most important contributions was his marriage diplomacy. His own marriage to Anne of Kiev in 1051 was remarkable for its time, reaching across the vast distance to the Russian principalities to find a bride. This marriage brought new blood into the Capetian line and established connections with Eastern Europe that would prove valuable in later centuries. Anne herself was a remarkable figure, literate in several languages and active in government, signing royal charters with her name in Cyrillic script. The birth of Henry and Anne's son Philip in 1052 secured the succession, and following Capetian tradition, Henry had the boy crowned as co-king in 1059, just a year before his own death. This smooth succession, the third in a row for the dynasty, was beginning to establish the Capetians as the natural and inevitable rulers of France in the minds of both nobles and common people. Philip I, who ruled from 1060 to 1108, faced perhaps the greatest challenges yet confronted by a Capetian king. His reign coincided with the Norman conquest of England, which created a situation where one of his nominal vassals, the Duke of Normandy, was now also a king and arguably more powerful than Philip himself. The reign also saw the beginning of the Crusades, the great reform movement in the Church associated with Pope Gregory VII, and significant economic and social changes as Europe began to emerge from the localism of the early Middle Ages. Philip's response to these challenges was mixed. He was not a particularly effective military leader, and his attempts to contain Norman power largely failed. His personal life created scandals that damaged royal prestige, particularly his bigamous marriage to Bertrade de Montfort, which led to his excommunication. But Philip also showed the Capetian talent for survival and gradual advancement. He expanded the royal domain through careful acquisitions, developed the royal administration, and began the process of asserting royal rights over the church in France that would become so important to later Capetian kings. The development of the royal administration under Philip III deserves particular attention. The king began to rely increasingly on low-born clerks and administrators rather than great nobles for the day-to-day governance of the realm. These men, who owed everything to royal favour, were naturally more loyal than aristocrats with their own power bases. The royal chancery became more sophisticated, developing standardised forms for different types of royal acts and maintaining better records. The prévots who administered royal estates became more professional, and a rudimentary system of royal finances began to emerge. Philip's reign also saw important developments in the ideology of kingship. Despite his personal failings and political weakness, Philip maintained that he held his crown from God alone and owed obedience to no earthly power. This assertion of royal independence would be crucial for his successors, who would build on this ideological foundation to resist the claims of both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope to supreme authority over European monarchs. The economic changes of Philip's reign created both challenges and opportunities for the monarchy. The growth of towns and commerce began to create new sources of wealth independent of the traditional agricultural economy controlled by the nobility. Philip and his successors would gradually learn to tap into this new wealth through taxes, tolls, and alliances with urban communities against aristocratic power. The famous fair of Lendit, held near Paris, became an important source of royal revenue and helped establish Paris as a major commercial centre. By the end of Philip II's reign in 1108, the Capetian dynasty had survived for over a century. No small achievement in medieval Europe. The kingdom was still weak, the royal domain still small, and the great nobles still largely independent. But the foundations laid by Hugh Capet and his immediate successors had proven solid. The dynasty had established the hereditary principle, developed a basic administrative apparatus, created an ideology of sacred kingship, and begun the slow process of territorial expansion that would eventually create the Kingdom of France. The accession of Louis XVI in 1108 marked a turning point in Capetian history. Known as Louis the Fat due to his considerable girth in later life, he brought an energy and determination to the throne that had been lacking for generations. For the first time since Hugh Capet, a Capetian king would actively and aggressively assert royal authority, not through grand campaigns against foreign enemies, but through the patient, brutal work of subduing the lawless Castellans who had turned the Ile-de-France into a patchwork of robber baronies. Louis had not expected to be king. His older brother Philip had been the designated heir, crowned as co-king in the traditional Capetian manner. But Philip's death in a hunting accident in 1101 thrust Louis into the position of heir apparent. These years of preparation proved invaluable, as Louis gained military experience fighting the very castle lords he would later need to subdue as king. He learned the landscape of the royal domain intimately, understanding every castle, every road, every strategic river crossing. The challenge Louis faced in the royal domain itself shows how far royal authority had declined. Within a day's ride of Paris, robber barons held castles from which they terrorized merchants, pilgrims, and peasants alike. The lords of Montlhéry, Le Puiset, and Montmorency acted as independent princes, defying royal authority and making travel dangerous even on the roads leading to the capital. The famous castle of Montlhéry, controlling the road between Paris and Orleans, changed hands repeatedly as various nobles fought for control of its lucrative tolls and strategic position. Louis's response was methodical and relentless. Year after year, season after season, he led expeditions against these Castellans. The castle of Le Puiset alone required 4 separate campaigns to finally subdue. Hugh of Le Puiset was captured, released, rebelled again, was captured again, and only finally submitted when Louis had destroyed his castle stone by stone. This pattern repeated across the Ile-de-France as Louis gradually imposed royal authority on the heartland of his kingdom. The military methods Louis employed were typical of 12th century warfare, but executed with unusual persistence. Castles were besieged, not usually taken by assault, but starved into submission. The lands around rebel castles were systematically devastated, crops burned, orchards cut down, villages destroyed, until the economic base that supported the castle's garrison was eliminated. It was brutal, destructive warfare, but it was effective. By the end of Louis's reign, the royal domain had been transformed from a collection of semi-independent castellanies into a unified territory under effective royal control. But Louis was more than just a warrior king. He understood that military force alone could not create lasting royal authority. He needed to build institutions, create networks of loyalty, and establish the monarchy as the natural centre of justice and order in the realm. His relationship with Suger, abbot of Saint-Denis, proved crucial in this regard. Suger was more than just a religious advisor. He was effectively the king's chief minister, a brilliant administrator who helped create the ideological and practical foundations of enhanced royal power. The monastery of Saint-Denis held special significance for the French monarchy. It housed the tombs of French kings, going back to the Merovingians, and its abbey church contained the sacred banner of Saint Denis, the oriflamme, which French kings would carry into battle for centuries to come. Under Suger's leadership, Saint-Denis became the centre of a royalist ideology that portrayed the Capetian kings as the special protectors of Saint Denis, the patron saint of France, and through him, of France itself. Suger's writings provide us with invaluable insights into the development of royal ideology during this period. In his biography of Louis VIII, Suger presents the king not as a feudal lord among other lords, but as a sacred figure with unique responsibilities for justice and peace throughout the realm. The king's wars against rebellious Castellans are portrayed not as private feudal conflicts, but as the necessary actions of a divinely appointed ruler bringing order to chaos. The development of royal justice under Louis VI represented a crucial expansion of monarchical power. The king's court began to hear appeals, not just from within the royal domain, but from across the realm. Great nobles who had disputes with each other increasingly turned to the royal court for arbitration, implicitly acknowledging the king's superior position. The principle that the king was the ultimate source of justice in the realm, though far from fully realized, was being established. Louis's intervention in communal movements showed another aspect of growing royal authority. As towns across northern France sought to free themselves from seigneurial control and establish communal governments, they looked to the king for support. Louis granted charters to several communes, including Laon and Amiens, establishing a pattern of alliance between the monarchy and urban communities that would be crucial for later Capetian kings. These alliances provided the king with financial resources from wealthy towns and military forces independent of feudal levies. The reign of Louis VI also saw important developments in royal administration. The household offices that had existed since Carolingian times, the seneschal, constable, chancellor, and butler, began to evolve from personal service positions into governmental departments. The chancery in particular grew in importance, developing more sophisticated record-keeping systems and standardized procedures for issuing royal documents. The beginning of continuous royal records dates from this period, though most of these early documents have been lost. The king's relationship with the church during this period was complex but generally supportive of royal power. The investiture controversy that had rocked the German Empire had less impact in France, where kings had never claimed the right to appoint bishops as extensively as the German emperors had. Louis worked closely with reformist churchmen, supporting their efforts to improve clerical discipline, while they supported his efforts to establish order in the realm. The ideology of the king as protector of churches and the poor, a central element of medieval kingship, was strongly emphasized during Louis's reign. One of the most significant events of Louis's reign was his conflict with Henry of England and Normandy. The English king's nephew, William Clito, had a claim to Normandy, and Louis supported him as a way to weaken English power. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Bremule in 1119, where Louis was defeated, but the political manoeuvring continued. More important than the military outcome was the fact that Louis was able to mobilize a large coalition of French nobles against the English king, demonstrating that the Capetian monarch could act as a leader of the French baronage against external threats. The marriage of Louis's son and heir, the future Louis VII, to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1137 represented a tremendous coup for the Capetian dynasty. Eleanor was the heiress to the vast duchy of Aquitaine, which covered much of southwestern France. The marriage would potentially add territories to the royal domain larger than everything the Capetians had accumulated in 150 years. It seemed to promise a dramatic expansion of royal power. Louis VI died on August 1, 1137, having transformed the Capetian monarchy from a weak, barely functional institution into an active, aggressive force in French politics. His son, Louis VII, inherited a kingdom where royal authority in the domain was secure, where the principle of royal justice was established, and where the monarchy had begun to emerge as the natural leader of the French nobility. But Louis VII would face challenges his father could not have imagined, and his reign would see both the greatest opportunity and the greatest disaster yet faced by the Capetian dynasty. Louis VIII began his reign with enormous advantages. Young, pious, and married to the richest heiress in France, he seemed destined to dramatically expand royal power. His early years showed promise. He intervened successfully in Champagne, demonstrating royal authority over one of the great feudal principalities. He supported Pope Innocent II against the anti-pope Anacletus, earning ecclesiastical support. He seemed to be following in his father's footsteps, but on a larger stage. However, Louis VII's personality was very different from his father's. Where Louis VI had been practical and forceful, Louis VII was contemplative and hesitant. His piety, while genuine, sometimes led him into political difficulties. His decision to burn the church at Vitry during a conflict with the Count of Champagne, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of refugees who had sought sanctuary there, haunted him for the rest of his life, and may have influenced his decision to go on crusade as penance. The Second Crusade of 1147 to 1149 was a disaster for Louis VII and for the Capetian monarchy. Inspired by the charismatic preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux and seeking to expiate his sins, Louis took the cross and led a large French army to the Holy Land. The expedition was poorly planned and executed. The French army was repeatedly ambushed in Anatolia, suffered from disease and starvation, and ultimately accomplished nothing of significance. The failure damaged royal prestige and drained the royal treasury. But the Crusade's most lasting consequence was the deterioration of Louis's marriage to Eleanor. The strains of the journey, combined with their incompatible personalities and Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir, led to increasing estrangement. Rumours of Eleanor's infidelity, particularly with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, whether true or not, further poisoned the relationship. By the time they returned to France, the marriage was effectively over. The annulment of Louis and Eleanor's marriage in 1152 was one of the most consequential decisions in medieval European history. On the grounds of consanguinity, they were related within the prohibited degrees. The marriage was dissolved. Eleanor retained her vast duchy of Aquitaine, and within 2 months she married Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, who would become King Henry II of England in 1154. This marriage created the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Henry II now controlled more of France than Louis VII did. The French king was faced with a vassal who was also a king, who controlled the Atlantic coast of France, and who had the resources to challenge Capetian authority as no one had done before. The struggle between the Capetians and the Angevins would dominate French politics for the next century. Louis VII's response to this challenge showed both his weaknesses and his strengths. He could not match Henry's military power or financial resources, but he could use the weapons of feudal law, diplomatic manoeuvring, and patient resistance. He supported Henry's rebellious sons when they rose against their father. He offered sanctuary to Thomas Becket during his conflict with Henry. He slowly built coalitions of French nobles worried about Angevin power. The development of Paris as a true capital city accelerated under Louis VII. The king granted a charter to the merchants of Paris, establishing the beginning of municipal government. The construction of Notre Dame Cathedral began in 1163, symbolizing Paris's growing importance. The schools of Paris, which would soon coalesce into the University of Paris, were attracting students from across Europe. Philip Augustus, Louis's son and successor, would be born into a city that was becoming one of the great centres of European civilization. Louis VII's administrative innovations, though less dramatic than his father's military campaigns, were equally important for the growth of royal power. He began the practice of sending out enquêteurs, royal officials, who investigated complaints against local administrators and reported directly to the king. This system would be greatly expanded by his successors and would become a crucial tool for extending royal authority throughout the realm. The birth of Philip Augustus on August 21st, 1165, after Louis had been married 3 times and had almost given up hope of a male heir, seemed miraculous to contemporaries. The boy was carefully educated for kingship, trained in both the arts of war and the arts of government. When Louis suffered a paralytic stroke in 1179, he had Philip crowned as co-king, maintaining the Capetian tradition that had served the dynasty so well. Philip II, known to history as Philip Augustus, ascended to sole rule upon his father's death in 1180 at the age of 15. No one could have predicted that this sickly youth, who had nearly died from illness during a hunting expedition just months after his coronation, would become the architect of French royal power and transform the Capetian monarchy from a weak feudal kingship into one of the strongest states in Europe. His reign of 43 years would see the royal domain increase fourfold, the development of sophisticated governmental institutions, and the decisive victory over the Angevin Empire that established France as a major European power. Philip's character was complex and often contradictory. He was physically unprepossessing, blind in one eye from his youthful illness, nervous and high-strung, afraid of the dark and terrified of thunderstorms. Yet he possessed an iron will, a brilliant political mind, and a ruthless determination to expand royal power by any means necessary. Unlike his father's contemplative piety, Philip's religion was practical and political. He supported the church when it served his interests, and opposed it when it did not. He was called Augustus, not for personal grandeur, but because he had augmented the realm, as the Roman Emperor Augustus had augmented Rome. The young king faced immediate challenges. The great nobles, sensing weakness in a teenage monarch, began asserting their independence. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Burgundy, and the Count of Champagne formed coalitions against royal power. Most dangerously, Henry II of England controlled more of France than Philip did. The Angevin Empire seemed an insurmountable obstacle to Capetian ambitions. Philip's early strategy showed the cunning that would characterize his entire reign. Unable to confront Henry directly, he exploited divisions within the Angevin family. Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were frequently in rebellion against their father, resentful of his refusal to grant them real power. Philip offered support to each in turn, playing son against father and brother against brother with masterful skill. The death of Henry the young king in 1183 and Geoffrey in 1186 simplified the succession, but intensified the conflict between Henry II and his surviving sons, Richard and John. Philip allied himself with Richard, the future Lionheart, against Henry II. Together they waged war on the aging English king, forcing him to acknowledge Richard as his heir and to make humiliating concessions to Philip. Henry II died in 1189, defeated and betrayed, supposedly cursing his sons with his dying breath. Richard the Wise's accession to the English throne changed the dynamic completely. Richard the Lionheart was everything Philip was not. Tall, handsome, charismatic, and one of the greatest warriors of his age. But Philip had advantages too. While Richard was a better general, Philip was a better king. While Richard spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, Philip devoted himself entirely to strengthening France. The Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192 brought Philip and Richard together as uneasy allies. Both kings took the cross and led their armies to the Holy Land. But their cooperation quickly turned to rivalry. Philip, ill with fever and dysentery, accomplished little militarily and returned to France after the capture of Acre, leaving Richard to continue the crusade alone. This early departure was criticised by contemporaries, but proved strategically brilliant. While Richard won glory but no lasting success in the Holy Land, Philip used his absence to undermine Angevin power in France. He negotiated with John, Richard's younger brother, offering him support for his claim to the English throne. He attacked Angevin territories in Normandy. When Richard was captured on his way home from crusade by Duke Leopold of Austria, and then held for ransom by Emperor Henry VI, Philip tried to prolong his captivity by offering the emperor money to keep Richard prisoner. Richard's return to France in 1194 led to 5 years of intense warfare between the two kings. Richard built the magnificent Château Gaillard on the Seine to protect Normandy from Philip's advances. The castle, constructed at enormous expense with the latest military architecture, seemed impregnable. Richard boasted that he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. The war seesawed back and forth, with neither king able to achieve decisive victory. Richard's superior generalship won most of the battles, but Philip's strategic vision and diplomatic manoeuvring gradually strengthened his position. The construction of a new wall around Paris, parts of which still survive today, showed Philip's determination to protect and glorify his capital. The creation of the Archives Royales, a permanent repository for royal documents, demonstrated his understanding that administrative efficiency was as important as military might. Richard's death in 1199 from a crossbow wound received while besieging a minor castle in Aquitaine transformed the situation entirely. John, who succeeded as King of England, was a far less formidable opponent. Known as John Lackland for his initial lack of inheritance and later as John Softsword for his military incompetence, he provided Philip with the opportunity he had been waiting for. Philip's conquest of the Angevin Empire was methodical and legally sophisticated. As feudal overlord, he summoned John to his court to answer charges regarding the murder of Arthur of Brittany, John's nephew and rival claimant to the English throne. When John refused to appear, Philip declared him a contumacious vassal and confiscated his French fiefs. This legal framework gave Philip's conquests legitimacy in the eyes of contemporaries who might otherwise have seen them as naked aggression. The campaign of 1202-1204 saw the collapse of Angevin power in northern France. Philip captured castle after castle, town after town, with remarkable speed. The great Château Gaillard, Richard's impregnable fortress, fell after a siege of just 6 months. Philip's engineers had found a weakness in the castle's design, entering through the latrines and opening the gates from within. With Château Gaillard gone, the road to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, lay open. The fall of Rouen in June 1204 marks the end of Normandy as an independent duchy. For the first time since 911, when the Viking leader Rollo had been granted the territory, Normandy was under direct royal control. Philip entered the city in triumph, and the Norman barons, abandoned by John, who had fled to England, swore allegiance to their new master. The conquest of Normandy alone doubled the royal domain and provided Philip with enormous new resources. But Philip did not stop there. Maine, Anjou and Touraine, the heartland of the Angevin Empire, fell in rapid succession. The Loire Valley, with its rich agricultural lands and strategic castles, came under Capetian control. Poitou, though more resistant, was gradually subdued. By 1206, John retained only a precarious hold on Aquitaine in southwestern France, and even there his authority was challenged. The administrative integration of these conquered territories showed Philip's genius as an organizer. Rather than simply adding them to the royal domain, he created new administrative structures to govern them. The office of bailli, or bailiff, was established to oversee royal justice and administration in the newly acquired lands. These bailiffs were salaried officials, not feudal lords, chosen for their competence and loyalty to the crown. They were regularly rotated to prevent them from developing local power bases, and they reported directly to the king. Philip's financial innovations were equally important. The conquest of Normandy and other Angevin territories brought enormous wealth to the crown, but Philip systematized royal finances in ways that created lasting prosperity. He established the temple in Paris as a royal treasury, separate from the household finances. Regular accounting procedures were introduced, with 3 annual sessions where bailiffs presented their accounts. The famous account of 1202 to 1203, which survives to this day, shows royal revenues of about £197,000 parisis, an enormous sum that made Philip one of the richest monarchs in Europe. The Battle of Bouvines on July 27, 1214, represented the climax of Philip's reign and one of the decisive battles of medieval history. John of England had formed a grand coalition against Philip, including Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne. The allied army was larger and seemed certain to defeat the French. Philip's forces were outnumbered and faced enemies on multiple fronts. The battle itself was a close-run affair. Philip himself was pulled from his horse and nearly killed before his bodyguards rescued him. But French discipline and the loyalty Philip had cultivated among his nobles won the day. The Emperor Otto fled the field, leaving behind the imperial eagle standard. The Count of Flanders was captured along with numerous other enemy nobles. The victory was total and transformative. Bouvines had consequences far beyond the battlefield. In England, John's defeat led directly to the baronial rebellion that forced him to sign Magna Carta in 1215. In Germany, Otto IV lost his throne to Frederick II. In France, Philip Augustus was now unchallenged, his authority established beyond question. The battle became a founding myth of French national identity, proof that God favoured the French king and the French people. Philip's relationship with the church was complex and often troubled. His marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1193 turned into a personal and political disaster when Philip, for reasons that remain mysterious, took an instant dislike to his new bride and sought an annulment the day after the wedding. When the church refused, Philip married Agnes of Marania anyway, leading to his excommunication and an interdict on France. For 7 years, Philip resisted papal pressure before finally submitting and taking Ingeborg back, though he never lived with her as his wife. Despite these conflicts, Philip understood the importance of presenting himself as a Christian king. He supported the Albigensian crusade against the Cathar heretics in southern France, though he carefully avoided direct involvement that might have entangled him in the complex politics of the Midi. He patronised churches and monasteries, particularly in newly conquered territories, where royal generosity could win loyalty from influential clerics. The transformation of Paris under Philip Augustus was remarkable. When he became king, Paris was still essentially a medieval town with narrow, muddy streets and wooden buildings. By his death, it was becoming a true capital city. Philip paved the main streets, built new marketplaces, and constructed the fortress of the Louvre to protect the city's western approach. The city walls he built enclosed 625 acres, making Paris one of the largest cities in Europe. The University of Paris, which received its first royal charter from Philip in 1200, became the intellectual centre of Europe during his reign. Students and masters from across Christendom came to study theology, law, and the liberal arts. The university's independence from local ecclesiastical authority, guaranteed by Philip, made it a unique institution that would shape European thought for centuries. The greatest minds of the age, including future saints and scholars, walked the streets of Philip's Paris. Philip's legal reforms laid the groundwork for a centralised legal system. While respecting local customs and privileges, he established the principle that royal justice was supreme. The Parliament of Paris, which would become France's highest court, began to take shape during his reign as a specialised judicial section of the royal courts. Royal ordinances began to have force throughout the realm, not just in the royal domain. The registration and organisation of royal documents showed Philip's understanding that effective government required effective record-keeping. The Archives Royales, established after the loss of royal documents at the Battle of Freteval in 1194 became a permanent institution. Registers of royal acts were kept systematically, allowing the Crown to maintain records of grants, privileges, and obligations. This administrative memory gave the monarchy a tremendous advantage over nobles who relied on oral tradition and scattered documents. Philip's treatment of the Jews in his realm revealed both the prejudices of his age and his financial opportunism. In 1182, early in his reign, he expelled the Jews from the royal domain and confiscated their property, a move that brought significant wealth to the royal treasury. He later allowed them to return in exchange for heavy taxes, then expelled them again in a cycle of exploitation that would be repeated by his successors. The king's relationship with the towns and communes showed his political sophistication. He granted charters to numerous towns, giving them rights of self-government in exchange for financial and military support. These urban communities became crucial allies against noble power, providing the Crown with resources independent of feudal obligations. The bourgeois of Paris, Rouen, and other major cities became strong supporters of royal authority. Military innovations under Philip Augustus transformed French warfare. He developed a more professional army, with paid sergeants supplementing feudal levies. Crossbowmen, despite ecclesiastical condemnation of their weapons, became a regular part of royal forces. Most importantly, Philip understood siege warfare, investing in engineers and siege equipment that could reduce the strongest castles. His systematic approach to fortification, both in building new castles and destroying those of defeated enemies, showed a strategic vision rare in medieval warfare. The last years of Philip's reign were spent consolidating his conquests and preparing for the succession. His son Louis had proven himself a capable military leader in the Albigensian Crusade and in a remarkable adventure when he was invited by rebellious English barons to become King of England. Though this invasion ultimately failed, Philip could be confident that his life's work would continue under capable leadership. When Philip Augustus died on July 14, 1223, at Mantes, he left a transformed kingdom. The royal domain had increased from about 28,000 square kilometres to over 120,000. Royal revenues had quadrupled. The institutions of government, financial, judicial, and administrative, had been revolutionised. Most importantly, the idea of France as a unified kingdom under a powerful monarchy had been established. Philip had found a feudal kingship. He left a medieval state. Louis VIII's reign was brief but significant, lasting only 3 years from 1223 to 1226. Known as the Lion for his military prowess, he had already proven himself a formidable warrior during his father's lifetime. His expedition to England in 1216, though ultimately unsuccessful, had demonstrated French military power and his own capabilities as a commander. As king, he continued his father's work of consolidation and expansion, particularly in the south of France, where the Albigensian Crusade provided opportunities for royal intervention. The Albigensian Crusade had begun in 1209 as a religious war against the Cathar heretics of Languedoc, but it quickly became a political conflict between the northern French nobility and the independent lords of the south. Louis VIII saw an opportunity to extend royal authority into regions that had never acknowledged Capetian sovereignty. His campaign of 1226 was brilliantly successful, capturing the key city of Avignon after a 3-month siege and forcing the submission of most of Languedoc. But Louis's triumph was cut short by death. Returning from the south, he fell ill with dysentery and died on November 8, 1226, at the age of 39. His death created a crisis for the Capetian monarchy. His heir, Louis IX, was only 12 years old, and France had not seen a minority since the Carolingian period. The great nobles, subdued by Philip Augustus, saw an opportunity to regain their independence. The regency of Blanche of Castile, Louis VIII's widow, proved to be one of the most remarkable periods of female rule in medieval history. Blanche, a granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, possessed political skills that matched those of any king. Faced with immediate rebellions from the counts of Champagne, Brittany, and other great nobles, she manoeuvred with skill and determination to preserve her son's inheritance. Blanche's methods combined military force, diplomatic negotiation, and careful alliance building. When the Count of Champagne threatened Paris, she mobilized the urban militias to defend the capital. When the nobles tried to kidnap the young king, she outmaneuvered them with rapid movements and loyal supporters. She made peace with some enemies while isolating others, never allowing a unified coalition to form against the regency. The Treaty of Paris in 1229, which ended the Albigensian Crusade, was Blanche's masterpiece. Raymond VII of Toulouse, the most powerful southern lord, was forced to accept terms that effectively brought Languedoc under royal control. His daughter and heiress was married to Louis XIX's brother, Alphonse, ensuring that Toulouse would eventually pass to the Capetian family. The University of Toulouse was established to combat heresy through education, extending Parisian intellectual influence to the south. Young Louis IX grew up in this atmosphere of political struggle and religious devotion. Blanche ensured he received the finest education available, studying Latin, theology, and the arts of government. But more importantly, she instilled in him a deep personal piety that would define his entire life. Louis heard Mass daily, often multiple times, and engaged in regular prayer, fasting, and acts of charity. His religious devotion was not merely formal, but deeply felt and personally transformative. When Louis assumed personal rule around 1234, though Blanche continued to advise him throughout her life, he brought a new style to kingship. Where Philip Augustus had been cunning and pragmatic, Louis was idealistic and moral. He genuinely believed that a king should be the fountain of justice, the protector of the poor, and a model of Christian virtue. These were not new ideas, but Louis actually tried to live by them in ways that astonished contemporaries. The famous image of Louis dispensing justice under an oak tree at Vincennes captures something essential about his reign. Any subject, no matter how humble, could approach the king directly with grievances. Louis would listen patiently, ask questions, and render judgment based on his understanding of justice rather than legal technicalities. This personal accessibility was revolutionary in an age of increasing governmental complexity and distance between rulers and ruled. Louis's judicial reforms went far beyond personal interventions. He issued the Great Ordinance of 1254, which reformed the entire system of royal administration and justice. Bailiffs and other royal officials were forbidden from accepting gifts, participating in local business, or marrying into local families. They had to remain in their districts for 40 days after their terms ended to answer any complaints. These measures attacked the corruption that had begun to plague royal administration. The creation of the enquêteurs, special investigators who travelled throughout the realm investigating complaints against royal officials, showed Louis's determination to ensure just government. These enquêteurs had broad powers to correct abuses, return illegally seized property, and punish corrupt officials. Their reports, many of which survive, provide remarkable insights into the functioning and malfunctioning of medieval government. Louis's approach to feudal warfare was revolutionary. He sought to limit private wars between nobles, establishing the Quarantaine le Roi, a 40-day cooling-off period before hostilities could begin, during which royal mediators would attempt to resolve disputes peacefully. He banned judicial combat in royal courts, replacing it with investigation and witness testimony. These measures, though not always successful, represented attempts to create a more peaceful and law-governed society. The king's personal life became a model of Christian virtue that influenced European ideas of kingship for centuries. He wore simple clothes, often gave his food to the poor, and regularly washed the feet of beggars, in imitation of Christ. He founded hospitals, including the famous Coins Vangs for the blind, and endowed numerous religious houses. His charity was not abstract but personal. He was known to visit the sick, comfort the dying, and distribute alms with his own hands. Louis's marriage to Margaret of Provence in 1234 was both a love match and a political alliance. The couple had 11 children, and by all accounts their marriage was happy and affectionate. But Louis's piety sometimes created tensions. He practiced periods of abstinence, even within marriage, and his devotions could interfere with family life. Margaret reportedly complained that her mother-in-law Blanche was jealous of any time Louis spent with his wife, rather than at prayer or government business. The Seventh Crusade of 1248 to 1254 represented both the height of Louis's religious devotion and his greatest failure. Motivated by the fall of Jerusalem to the Muslims in 1244, Louis organised the best-prepared crusade yet launched. He spent years planning, accumulating supplies, and building a port at Aigues-Mortes specifically for the expedition. The crusade was to be a model of Christian warfare, with strict discipline, no attacks on fellow Christians, and fair treatment of non-combatants. The initial success in Egypt was promising. The Crusaders captured Damietta with minimal losses, and Louis established a Christian government there. But the advance toward Cairo proved disastrous. The army was struck by disease, the Nile flooding disrupted supply lines, and Muslim forces under the new Mamluk leadership proved more formidable than expected. At the Battle of Mansoura, Louis's brother Robert of Artois was killed along with much of the Templar order. The retreat from Mansoura turned into a catastrophe. Louis himself, weakened by dysentery, was captured along with most of his army. The negotiations for ransom were humiliating, requiring an enormous payment and the surrender of Damietta. Louis's conduct in captivity, maintaining dignity, and even converting some of his guards to Christianity, according to legend, enhanced his reputation for sanctity even in defeat. Rather than returning immediately to France, Louis spent 4 years in the Holy Land, fortifying the remaining Crusader cities and negotiating truces. His presence alone seemed to protect the Crusader states, and his departure in 1254 was seen as abandoning the Holy Land to its fate. The death of Blanche of Castile, who had been serving as regent in his absence, finally forced his return. The years following Louis's return from Crusade saw the full flowering of his governmental reforms. The Parliament of Paris was definitively organised as a permanent court of justice, meeting regularly with professional judges. The Chambre des Comptes was established to oversee royal finances with systematic auditing procedures. These institutions would survive for centuries, becoming fundamental to French government. Louis's monetary reforms stabilised the currency and promoted commerce. He established the principle that only royal money could circulate throughout the realm, though local coinages were still permitted in their own regions. The silver gros tournois became a reliable international currency, facilitating trade and enhancing royal revenues. His commercial policies, including protection for merchants and standardization of weights and measures, helped create economic prosperity. The relationship between Louis and the Church was complex, despite his obvious piety. He supported the Church's spiritual mission, but resisted papal attempts to interfere in French temporal affairs. When Pope Innocent IV tried to tax the French clergy for papal wars, Louis prohibited the export of money from France without royal permission. This assertion of royal sovereignty over the national church would have important consequences for his successors. The Mise of Amiens in 1264 showed Louis's international reputation as an arbitrator. Henry III of England and his rebellious barons, led by Simon de Montfort, agreed to accept Louis's judgment in their dispute. Louis's decision, which favoured royal authority while acknowledging some baronial grievances, showed his political philosophy. He believed in strong monarchy, but also in the obligations of kings to rule justly and respect established rights. Louis's Second Crusade in 1270 was even more ill-conceived than the first. Now in his mid-50s and in declining health, he decided to attack Tunis, apparently believing its ruler might convert to Christianity. The expedition was a disaster from the start. The army was struck by disease almost immediately upon landing. Louis himself fell ill with what was probably dysentery or typhoid fever. The death of Louis XIX on August 25, 1270, near Tunis, was depicted by contemporaries as a saint's death. He reportedly spent his last hours instructing his son Philip on the duties of kingship, praying and receiving the sacraments. His last words were said to be, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." His body was boiled to separate the flesh from the bones, with different parts buried in different places, beginning the distribution of royal relics that would become important to Capetian prestige. The canonization of Louis Namour in 1297 by Pope Boniface VIII was the culmination of a long campaign by the French monarchy. The testimony collected for the canonization process provides remarkable details about Louis's life and character. Miracles were attributed to his relics, and his feast day became a celebration of both sanctity and French royal power. He became the only French king to be recognized as a saint, giving the Capetian dynasty a unique sacred status. Louis's legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. His conception of kingship as a sacred trust, requiring personal virtue and dedication to justice, influenced monarchical ideals throughout Europe. The institutions he created or reformed continued to function for centuries. His great-grandson Philip IV would use the prestige of St. Louis to justify very different policies, but always claimed to be following his saintly ancestors' example. The artistic and cultural achievements of Louis's reign marked a high point of medieval civilization. The Sainte-Chapelle, built to house the crown of thorns and other relics Louis had purchased from the Byzantine emperor, represented the pinnacle of Gothic architecture, its walls of stained glass creating an ethereal sacred space that seemed to transcend earthly reality. The illuminated manuscripts produced for Louis, including the magnificent Psalter of St. Louis, showed the sophistication of Parisian artistic workshops. The reign of Philip III, known as the Bold, from 1270 to 1285, has often been overshadowed by his father's sanctity and his son's controversial reign. But Philip III's 15 years as king saw important developments that built on Louis IX's achievements while adapting to new realities. His reign demonstrated that the Capetian monarchy had developed institutional strength that could survive even under a less exceptional ruler. Philip III inherited the throne under difficult circumstances, with the army still in Tunisia and his father's death creating a crisis of morale. His uncle Charles of Anjou, King of Sicily, took charge of the retreat, negotiating a face-saving treaty with the Tunisian ruler. The journey home was marked by further disasters, including the death of Philip's wife, Isabella of Aragon, and several other royal family members. The new king entered Paris with a train of coffins, hardly an auspicious beginning. Despite these challenges, Philip III proved to be a competent, if not brilliant, ruler. He continued his father's administrative reforms, further developing the Parlement and the financial administration. The royal domain continued to expand through inheritance and purchase rather than conquest. When his uncle Alphonse of Poitiers died without heirs in 1271, the vast county of Toulouse and other territories reverted to the crown. fulfilling the plans made during Blanche of Castile's regency. The acquisition of Toulouse was smoothly managed, with Philip respecting local customs and privileges while establishing royal administration. The seneschals appointed to govern the southern territories were often chosen from local families, easing the integration of these culturally distinct regions into the kingdom. The economic prosperity of the south, with its Mediterranean trade connections, significantly enhanced royal revenues. Philip's foreign policy was ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful. The Aragonese Crusade of 1285, launched to support his uncle Charles of Anjou's claims in Sicily, ended in disaster. Philip led a large army across the Pyrenees, but was unable to achieve decisive victory. Disease struck the army, Philip himself fell mortally ill, and the expedition collapsed. He died on October 5, 1285, at Perpignan, another Capetian king dying far from Paris on a failed military expedition. Yet Philip III's reign was not without achievements. He strengthened royal justice, expanded the use of written law, and continued the process of administrative centralization. The royal court became more sophisticated, with specialized departments handling different aspects of government. The cultural brilliance of Louis IX's reign continued, with Paris maintaining its position as the intellectual capital of Europe. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, for his striking good looks, ascended to the throne in 1285 at the age of 17. No one could have predicted that this silent, enigmatic young man would become one of the most controversial and transformative kings in French history. His reign of 29 years would see the monarchy reach new heights of power, but also engage in conflicts that would shake the foundations of medieval Christendom. Philip's personality remains a mystery even today. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as handsome beyond compare, tall and blonde with piercing blue eyes, but also cold, remote, and impossibly to read. He rarely spoke in public, preferring to let his ministers announce his decisions. Some historians have seen him as a passive figure, manipulated by evil counsellors. Others, as a cunning autocrat who used subordinates to shield himself from blame. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. The financial crisis that dominated Philip's reign began almost immediately. His father had left debts from the failed Aragonese Crusade, and Philip's own ambitions required resources far beyond traditional royal revenues. Medieval kings were expected to live of their own, financing government from domain revenues and customary dues. But the costs of increasingly sophisticated administration, permanent military forces, and ambitious foreign policies made this impossible. Philip's financial expedients were creative, ruthless, and often destructive. He debased the coinage repeatedly, causing economic chaos but providing short-term profit to the royal treasury. He taxed the clergy, provoking conflict with the papacy. He expelled the Jews in 1306, confiscating their property and debts owed to them. Most notoriously, he destroyed the Knights Templar, Europe's most powerful military order, to seize their vast wealth. The conflict with Pope Boniface the White from 1296 to 1303 represented a fundamental challenge to medieval assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The immediate cause was Philip's taxation of the French clergy to finance his war with England. Boniface issued the bull Clericus Laicos, forbidding secular rulers from taxing clergy without papal permission. Philip responded by prohibiting the export of money from France, cutting off French revenues to Rome. The conflict escalated dramatically when Philip arrested the Bishop of Pamiers on charges of treason in 1301. Boniface demanded his release and summoned the French bishops to Rome to discuss the king's behaviour. Philip responded by calling the first Estates General in French history in 1302, assembling representatives of clergy, nobility, and towns to support him against the Pope. This appeal to national sentiment against foreign interference marked a new development in European politics. Boniface's Bull Unam Sanctum in 1302 made the most extreme claims for papal supremacy ever formally stated, declaring that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. Philip's response was equally extreme. His minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, led a force that arrested Boniface at Anagni in September 1303. Though the elderly Pope was soon released, he died within weeks, apparently from the shock and humiliation. The election of Clement V, a Frenchman, as Pope in 1305, and the subsequent move of the papacy to Avignon in 1309 represented Philip's complete victory. For the next 70 years, the papacy would remain in France, under effective French control. This Babylonian captivity, as critics called it, fundamentally damaged papal prestige and contributed to the later Great Schism. The destruction of the Knights Templar from 1307 to 1314 was Philip's most dramatic and controversial act. The Templars were warrior monks who had grown enormously wealthy from donations and banking operations. They were independent of royal authority, owing allegiance only to the Pope, and their Paris temple served as a fortress and treasury in the heart of the capital. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France. The charges against them were sensational: heresy, idol worship, sodomy, and blasphemy. Under torture, many Templars confessed to these crimes, though most later retracted their confessions. The trial that followed was a travesty of justice, with Philip pressuring the Pope to dissolve the order and burning those who refused to confess, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, at the stake. The real motivation for the Templar persecution was almost certainly financial. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums and coveted their wealth. Though he gained less than expected, as much Templar treasure mysteriously disappeared, the destruction of the order removed a powerful independent force and demonstrated the king's ruthless determination. Philip's administrative innovations were more constructive than his financial expedients. He greatly expanded the royal bureaucracy, creating new institutions and procedures that increased governmental efficiency. The Parlement of Paris was divided into specialized chambers for different types of cases. The Chambre des Comptes became more sophisticated in its accounting procedures. The Royal Council was organized into specialized sections dealing with different aspects of government. The lawyers who staffed Philip's administration, known as legistes, brought Roman law concepts into French government. They argued that the king was emperor in his own kingdom, subject to no external authority. They developed theories of royal sovereignty that went far beyond traditional feudal concepts. The king, they claimed, could make law for the common good, tax for necessity, and judge all subjects directly. These legistes, men like Guillaume de Nogaret, Guillaume de Plaisance, and Pierre Flotte, were mostly from southern France, where Roman law traditions were strong. They were often of modest origins, owing everything to royal service. Their loyalty to Philip was absolute, and they provided intellectual justification for his most controversial acts. They represented a new type of government servant, professional, educated, and devoted to expanding state power. The transformation of the royal court under Philip IV reflected broader changes in French society. The court became more formal and hierarchical, with elaborate ceremonials emphasizing royal majesty. The king's physical person became increasingly sacred and remote. Access to the king was strictly controlled, and royal appearances were carefully staged to maximize their impact. The development of royal propaganda under Philip was remarkable for its sophistication. Royal acts were justified in elaborate preambles explaining their necessity for the common good. Pamphlets defending royal policies circulated throughout the realm, the University of Paris was enlisted to support royal positions in theological and legal disputes. This propaganda machine proved particularly effective during the conflict with Boniface VIII. Philip's wars with England and Flanders demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Capetian power. The war with Edward V of England over Gascony from 1294 to 1303 was expensive and inconclusive. Though Philip won some victories, he could not completely expel the English from southwestern France. The peace settlement essentially restored the status quo, showing that even Philip's enhanced royal power had limits. The Flemish wars were even more frustrating. Flanders was enormously wealthy from its cloth industry and trade, and Philip coveted its resources. But the Flemish cities, led by merchants and artisans, resisted French domination. The devastating French defeat at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, where Flemish infantry destroyed the flower of French chivalry, shocked contemporary opinion and demonstrated that traditional military superiority could no longer be taken for granted. The Estates General, which Philip summoned in 1302, 1308 and 1314, represented an important constitutional innovation. By assembling representatives of the three orders of society, clergy, nobility and commons, Philip created a national forum that could legitimize controversial policies. Though the Estates General did not develop the powers of the English Parliament, it provided a mechanism for consultation between crown and subjects that would become important in later crises. Philip's family life was marked by scandal that damaged royal prestige. His three sons' wives were all accused of adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair of 1314. Two were imprisoned for life, and their alleged lovers were executed with horrible tortures. The scandal raised questions about the legitimacy of potential heirs and created an atmosphere of moral corruption around the throne. The death of Philip the Fair on November 29, 1314, from a stroke while hunting, came at a moment when his policies seemed triumphant. He had humbled the papacy, destroyed the Templars, expanded royal administration, and greatly increased royal power. But he had also created numerous enemies and left a legacy of financial chaos and moral controversy. The legend that Jacques de Molay cursed Philip and his line from the stake, whether true or not, captured contemporary unease about his methods. Philip's immediate legacy was catastrophic. His three sons would all reign briefly and die without male heirs, ending the direct Capetian line that had ruled since 987. The financial expedients he had used left the monarchy in perpetual fiscal crisis. The precedents he had set for royal absolutism would inspire future kings but also provoke resistance. The moral questions raised by his reign would haunt the French monarchy. Yet Philip's long-term impact was transformative. He had created the administrative and ideological foundations of the modern state. His assertion of royal sovereignty against papal claims helped establish the principle of national independence. His use of representative assemblies, though intended to support royal power, created institutions that would later challenge it. For better or worse, Philip the Fair had transformed the French monarchy from a feudal kingship into something approaching a sovereign state. The death of Philip the Fair in 1314 initiated a series of rapid successions that would end the direct Capetian line. Louis VI, called the Headstrong, inherited a kingdom in turmoil. The reaction against his father's policies was immediate and fierce. Leagues of nobles formed in various provinces, demanding the restoration of traditional rights and the punishment of Philip's ministers. Louis was forced to grant charters confirming provincial privileges and to sacrifice some of his father's most hated advisers, including Enguerrand de Marigny, who was hanged at Montfaucon. Louis XI's reign lasted barely 18 months, but it revealed the fragility of the authoritarian system Philip IV had built. Without Philip's iron will and mysterious authority, the machinery of government faltered. The new king attempted to continue his father's wars in Flanders, but achieved nothing except further debt. His attempts to raise money through taxation met fierce resistance. The nobility, emboldened by royal weakness, began reasserting their independence. The personal life of Louis XIV added to the monarchy's troubles. His wife, Margaret of Burgundy, had been imprisoned for adultery in the Tour de Nesle scandal. Louis sought an annulment to remarry and produce an heir, but Margaret conveniently died in prison under suspicious circumstances. His second marriage to Clementia of Hungary produced a posthumous son, John V, who lived only 5 days, earning him the sad distinction of being the shortest reigning king in French history. The succession crisis that followed baby John's death in 1316 was unprecedented in Capetian history. For over 3 centuries, there had always been a clear male heir. Now the crown was disputed between Louis VI's daughter Joan and his brother Philip. The assembly of nobles that gathered to decide the succession made a momentous decision. They declared that women could not inherit the French throne, invoking an ancient Frankish law that may or may not have actually existed. This decision, establishing what would later be called the Salic law, had enormous consequences. It excluded not just Joan, but all female lines from succession, a principle that would later prevent Edward III of England, grandson of Philip the Fair, through his mother, from claiming the French throne. The 100 Years' War would be fought largely over this interpretation of succession law. Philip V, known as the Tall, proved to be a more capable ruler than his brother. His reign from 1316 to 1322 saw serious attempts at administrative and financial reform. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the currency, and tried to establish more efficient tax collection. He attempted to create a unified legal system and to rationalize the chaotic administrative structure he had inherited. Philip V's assemblies of 1317 and 1321 showed a new approach to governance. Rather than simply demanding support as his father had done, Philip engaged in genuine consultation with representatives of different social groups. He sought to build consensus for his reforms and to address grievances. This more collaborative approach to government might have succeeded given time, but Philip died suddenly in 1322, leaving only daughters. Charles IV, the last son of Philip the Fair, succeeded his brother and ruled from 1322 to 1328. Known as the Fair like his father, Charles was intelligent and capable, but he faced impossible challenges. The kingdom's finances were in ruins, with revenues barely covering the interest on royal debts. The great nobles were increasingly assertive, and royal authority outside the domain was weakening. Charles's foreign policy was ambitious but unsuccessful. He intervened in the succession dispute in the Holy Roman Empire, supporting the French candidate against Ludwig of Bavaria. He planned a crusade that never materialized. He became involved in English politics, supporting Isabella, sister of the French kings and estranged wife of Edward II of England, in her successful coup against her husband. This intervention would have unforeseen consequences when Isabella's son Edward III later claimed the French throne. The death of Charles IV on February 1, 1328, without a male heir, marked the end of the direct Capetian line. For 341 years, son had succeeded father in an unbroken chain stretching back to Hugh Capet. This remarkable continuity had given the French monarchy stability and legitimacy that was the envy of other European kingdoms. Now that continuity was broken, and the succession was again in dispute, the choice of Philip of Valois as Philip VI was not inevitable. Edward III of England, as grandson of Philip the Fair, had a strong claim if succession through the female line was accepted. Charles of Navarre, grandson of Louis XVI, also had supporters. But the French nobility, faced with the prospect of an English king or a child king, chose Philip of Valois, a mature man of 35, who was Philip the Fair's nephew through the male line. The principle that the French crown could not pass through women was now firmly established, though it would be contested with blood and iron for the next century. Philip VI began his reign in 1328 with considerable advantages. He was an experienced military commander, having served his cousins loyally during their reigns. The French nobility had chosen him precisely because he seemed capable of providing strong leadership. His early years showed promise, with a great victory over the Flemish rebels at Cassel in 1328 that seemed to restore French military prestige. But Philip's reign would ultimately be remembered for initiating the catastrophic conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The causes of the war were complex and deep-rooted. The English kings still held Gascony in southwestern France as vassals of the French crown, a situation that created constant friction. The French supported the Scots against England, while the English allied with the Flemish cities against France. Economic rivalries, particularly over the wool trade between England and Flanders, added another dimension to the conflict. But the dynastic dispute over Edward III's claim to the French throne transformed these various tensions into an existential struggle. Edward III was a very different opponent from his weak father, Edward VI. Young, energetic, and militarily gifted, he had restored order in England and was eager for foreign glory. Initially, he had done homage to Philip VI for Gascony, implicitly recognising Philip's kingship. But as tensions mounted, Edward revived his claim to the French throne, quartering the French royal arms with the English leopards and styling himself King of France and England. The early years of the war, from 1337 to 1340, saw inconclusive fighting. Edward's strategy of building a grand coalition against France proved expensive and largely ineffective. His allies took English gold, but provided little real support. The naval battle of Sluys in 1340, where the English destroyed the French fleet, gave England control of the Channel, but did not lead to decisive advantage on land. Both kingdoms were struggling financially, and a truce was arranged in 1340. The nature of warfare was changing in ways that would profoundly affect the conflict. The English had developed the longbow into a devastating weapon that could pierce armour at long range. English armies had learned in their wars against the Scots to fight defensively, using dismounted men-at-arms and archers in prepared positions. The French, by contrast, still relied on the mounted charge of heavily armoured knights, the traditional tactic that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The resumption of war in 1345 brought disaster for France. Edward's son, the Black Prince, launched a devastating raid through southwestern France, employing a strategy of deliberate destruction called chevauchée. The goal was not to conquer territory, but to destroy the economic basis of French royal power and demonstrate the French king's inability to protect his subjects. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations scattered in a systematic campaign of terror. The Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, shattered the myth of French military superiority. Philip VI's army, perhaps 30,000 strong, attacked Edward III's smaller force of about 9,000 men, who had taken up a defensive position on a hillside. The French attacks were brave but disorganised. Wave after wave of knights charged into a storm of English arrows. The blind King John of Bohemia, fighting for France, famously had his knights tie their horses to his, so he could charge into battle, where he was inevitably killed. By nightfall, the cream of French chivalry lay dead on the field, including 1,500 knights and nobles. Crécy was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological catastrophe. The social order of medieval France was based on the military superiority of the mounted knight. Now English yeomen with longbows had slaughtered the nobility of France. The implications were revolutionary. though not immediately understood. Philip VI's prestige never recovered from the defeat, and his remaining years were marked by further humiliations. The Black Death arrived in France in 1347, adding apocalyptic catastrophe to military defeat. The plague killed perhaps a third of the French population, disrupting agriculture, commerce, and administration. Whole villages were abandoned, tax revenues collapsed, and social order broke down in many regions. The monarchy, already weakened by military defeat, seemed powerless against this divine punishment. Philip VI died in 1350, leaving his son John II to inherit a kingdom in crisis. John, known as the Good, though he was neither particularly good nor competent, faced impossible challenges. The kingdom was devastated by plague and war, royal finances were in chaos, and English companies of mercenaries roamed the countryside even during truces, living off plunder and ransom. John II's attempts to restore royal authority and reform the currency met with limited success. He created the Order of the Star, a chivalric order meant to rival Edward III's Order of the Garter and restore noble morale, but his reign would be dominated by another catastrophic military defeat that exceeded even Crécy in its consequences. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, saw the destruction of another French army, and even worse, the capture of King John himself. The Black Prince, with a small force of perhaps 6,000 men, was trying to escape back to Bordeaux when he was cornered by a much larger French army. The French attacked the English defensive position with the same lack of coordination that had proved fatal at Crécy. The result was another slaughter, but this time the king himself was taken prisoner. The capture of the king created a constitutional crisis unprecedented in French history. The Dauphin Charles, only 18 years old and physically unimpressive, had to assume the regency while his father was held in comfortable but humiliating captivity in London. The Estates General, summoned to approve taxes for the king's ransom, instead attempted to seize control of the government. The leader of this attempted revolution was Etienne Marcel, provost of the merchants of Paris. Marcel allied with Charles of Navarre, called the Bad, who had his own claim to the throne, and attempted to establish a constitutional monarchy with the Estates General, controlling taxation and administration. For a brief moment, it seemed that France might develop along the lines of England, with a parliament limiting royal power. The Jacquerie of 1358, a massive peasant uprising triggered by the nobility's failure to protect the population, added another element of chaos. Peasants across northern France rose up, burning castles and killing nobles in an explosion of social hatred. The nobility, momentarily united by fear, suppressed the uprising with terrible brutality, but the social fabric of the kingdom had been torn beyond easy repair. The Dauphin Charles, showing unexpected political skill, outmaneuvered his opponents. He escaped from Paris, rallied loyal nobles, and gradually isolated Marcel and Charles the Bad. When Marcel was assassinated by his own supporters in July 1358, the revolutionary moment passed. Charles entered Paris and restored royal authority, though the kingdom remained in desperate condition. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 temporarily ended the war, but at a terrible price. John II's ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum. Edward III received full sovereignty over an enlarged Gascony, about a third of France. The treaty represented the nadir of Capetian fortunes, seeming to reverse centuries of patient territorial expansion. John II's return to France did not bring stability. Unable to raise his full ransom, and perhaps seeking to escape his problems through chivalric gesture, he voluntarily returned to captivity in England when one of the hostages for his ransom escaped. He died in London in 1364, a futile end to a futile reign. But his voluntary return, however politically foolish, enhanced the sacred aura of French kingship by demonstrating royal honour. Charles V, who succeeded his father in 1364, was an unlikely saviour for the Valois monarchy. Physically weak, scholarly rather than martial, he was called the Wise by contemporaries, who initially meant it mockingly. But Charles possessed intelligence, patience, and strategic vision that would transform French fortunes. His reign from 1364 to 1380 saw the almost complete reversal of English gains and the restoration of royal authority. Charles's strategy was revolutionary for a medieval king. He avoided battle, refusing to risk another Crécy or Poitiers. Instead, he adopted a strategy of attrition, using small forces to recapture castles and towns while avoiding major engagements. He found in Bertrand du Guesclin, a minor Breton noble of remarkable military talent, the perfect instrument for this strategy. Du Guesclin, made Constable of France, understood that the age of chivalric warfare was ending. The transformation of the French military under Charles V was comprehensive. Castles were modernised to withstand artillery, which was beginning to change siege warfare. The royal army became more professional, with regular pay reducing the incentive for plunder. Military ordinances regulated the conduct of war, attempting to limit the devastation that had characterized earlier campaigns. The free companies of mercenaries were either incorporated into royal service or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere, particularly in Spain. Charles's administrative reforms were equally important. He reorganized royal finances, establishing regular taxation that provided predictable revenues. The royal administration became more professional and efficient. The Parliament of Paris and other royal courts extended their jurisdiction, gradually establishing royal law as supreme throughout the realm. The royal library was expanded, making Charles one of the great bibliophiles of the medieval period. By Charles V's death in 1380, the English held only Calais and the coastal strip of Gascony. The French monarchy had recovered from the disasters of the previous generation, and royal authority was stronger than before the war began. But Charles's death, at the age of 42, leaving a child heir, would plunge France back into crisis. Charles VI's reign, from 1380 to 1422, began with a regency under his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon. These powerful princes used their control of the young king to pursue their own interests, draining the royal treasury for their personal projects. When Charles assumed personal rule at age 20 in 1388, there was hope for continued recovery. The young king was handsome, athletic, and initially showed promise as a ruler. The madness that struck Charles VI in 1392 transformed everything. While leading an expedition against the Duke of Brittany, Charles suddenly went berserk, attacking his own men and killing several before being subdued. This was the first of many episodes of insanity that would recur throughout his remaining 30 years. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and would break if touched. Other times he did not recognize his wife and children, or forgot he was king. The king's madness created a power vacuum that tore the kingdom apart. Two factions emerged, led by the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, and his uncle Philip the Bold of Burgundy. After Philip's death in 1404, his son John the Fearless continued the struggle. The conflict between Armagnacs, as Orleans' party became known, and Burgundians was not just political, but increasingly personal and vindictive. The assassination of Louis of Orleans by John the Fearless's agents in 1407 transformed factional conflict into civil war. Paris itself became a battleground, with different quarters controlled by different factions. Massacres became common, with the Burgundian massacre of Armagnacs in Paris in 1418 being particularly horrific. The monarchy, which under Charles V had seemed to be developing into a centralised state, fragmented into warring principalities. Henry V of England brilliantly exploited French divisions. His invasion in 1415 culminated in the Battle of Agincourt on October 25th, where once again English longbows destroyed a larger French army. The French losses were catastrophic, with much of the remaining nobility killed or captured. The battle demonstrated that the French had learned nothing from Crécy and Poitiers, still relying on undisciplined cavalry charges against prepared positions. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the ultimate humiliation. Charles VI, in one of his lucid periods, or perhaps manipulated by his handlers, disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognised Henry V of England as his heir. Henry married Charles VI's daughter Catherine, and their son would unite the crowns of France and England. It seemed that the Valois dynasty and French independence were finished. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, controlled only the territories south of the Loire, derisively called the Kingdom of Bourges by his enemies. He was weak, indecisive, and possibly illegitimate, as his mother Isabeau of Bavaria had been notoriously unfaithful. The English and Burgundians controlled Paris and most of northern France. By 1428 they were besieging Orleans, the last major city blocking their path to the south. The appearance of Joan of Arc in 1429 was so improbable that contemporaries and historians have struggled to explain it ever since. A teenage peasant girl from Domremy in Lorraine claimed that Saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret had commanded her to drive the English from France and crown the Dauphin at Reims. In any other circumstances she would have been dismissed as a madwoman. But France's situation was so desperate that even the impossible seemed worth trying. Joan's journey to the Dauphin's court at Chinon was itself remarkable. She convinced the local commander at Vaucouleurs to provide an escort through enemy territory. When she arrived at Chinon in February 1429, she somehow identified the Dauphin, though he had disguised himself among his courtiers. What she said to him privately remains unknown, but it convinced him to support her mission. Some historians speculate she assured him of his legitimacy, a crucial concern given the doubts about his parentage. The examination of Joan by theologians at Poitiers showed the careful balance the Dauphin had to maintain. He could not simply accept a potentially heretical visionary, but neither could he reject what might be divine intervention. The theologians found nothing heretical in Joan's claims and were impressed by her piety and simplicity. They recommended that she be tested by her works, essentially passing responsibility back to the Dauphin. Joan's military career was brief but transformative. Given armour and a household, she joined the army sent to relieve Orleans. Her presence transformed the morale of French forces. Soldiers who had been demoralised and defeatist suddenly believed victory was possible. Whether through divine intervention, psychological impact, or coincidence, the siege of Orleans was lifted within days of Joan's arrival in May 1429. The campaign that followed was equally remarkable. Joan convinced the reluctant Dauphin to march to Reims for his coronation, even though the route passed through enemy territory. Town after town surrendered without resistance, awed by Joan's reputation or convinced that God had switched sides. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned at Reims, with Joan standing beside him holding her banner, saying it had shared in the toil and deserved to share in the honour. The coronation at Reims was more than ceremonial. In an age that believed in sacred kingship, it transformed Charles from disputed Dauphin to anointed king. The holy oil of Clovis had touched him, making him God's chosen ruler of France. Even those who doubted his legitimacy or ability now had to acknowledge him as the true king. Joan had accomplished her primary mission, but Joan's capture at Compiègne in May 1430 by Burgundian forces began her tragic end. Sold to the English, she was tried for heresy and witchcraft in a carefully orchestrated trial at Rouen. The trial records, which survive in remarkable detail, show both Joan's extraordinary courage and intelligence, and the determination of her judges to destroy her. Her interrogators, learned theologians and lawyers, tried to trap her with complex theological questions, but her answers showed remarkable sophistication for an illiterate peasant girl. The execution of Joan of Arc on May 30th of 1431, burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen at the age of 19, was meant to demonstrate that Charles VII's coronation had been achieved through witchcraft. Instead, it created a martyr whose memory would inspire French resistance for generations. Even the English soldiers who witnessed her death were troubled, with some claiming to have seen a white dove fly from the flames. Charles VII's behaviour during Joan's trial and execution has been criticised for centuries. He made no attempt to ransom or rescue her, apparently willing to sacrifice the girl who had saved his throne. But politically, Joan had become a liability. Her insistence on continued aggressive war complicated diplomatic negotiations, and her popular following threatened established authorities. Her death, however shameful, removed a problem for the king. The transformation of Charles VII from the weak King of Bourges to Charles the Victorious took decades. The early 1430s saw continued military struggles with mixed results, but several factors gradually shifted the balance in France's favour. The alliance between England and Burgundy, always fragile, began to crack. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, increasingly saw his interests as divergent from England's. The Treaty of Arras in 1435, reconciling Charles VII with Burgundy, was the diplomatic turning point of the war. Philip the Good, in exchange for extensive concessions, including virtual independence for Burgundy, recognised Charles as King of France. Paris opened its gates to royal forces in 1436, and Charles entered the capital that had rejected him for nearly 20 years. The emotional scenes of reconciliation could not hide the deep scars left by civil war. Charles VII's military reforms, known as the Grande Ordonnance, created Europe's first permanent professional army. The Compagnies d'Ordonnance, established in 1445, consisted of cavalry units maintained at royal expense even in peacetime. These professional soldiers, regularly paid and disciplined, replaced the unreliable feudal levies and mercenary companies that had dominated medieval warfare. The Frank archers, a militia of bowmen, provided infantry support. The development of artillery under Charles VII changed the nature of warfare permanently. The Bureau brothers, Jean and Gaspard, created the world's most advanced artillery train. French cannons could reduce in days castles that would have resisted sieges for months. The age of castle-based feudal power was ending, replaced by a new era where only central governments could afford the expensive new weapons. The final campaigns of the 100 Years' War, from 1449 to 1453, showed French military superiority. Normandy fell in a single year, with castle after castle surrendering to French artillery. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 saw English forces in Normandy destroyed. In Gascony, the Battle of Castillon in 1453, where English commander John Talbot was killed by cannon fire, ended English hopes. Only Calais remained in English hands, a last foothold that would be retained for another century. Charles VII's later years were marked by conflicts with his son, the future Louis XV. The Dauphin, impatient for power and critical of his father's policies, engaged in repeated conspiracies. The Praguery Revolt of 1440, which Louis supported, attempted to impose aristocratic control over the monarchy. Its failure strengthened royal power, but the relationship between father and son remained poisonous. Louis fled to Burgundy in 1456, remaining in exile until his father's death. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc in 1456, with a church trial overturning her condemnation, showed Charles VII's concern for his legitimacy even after victory. If Joan had been a heretic, then his coronation was invalid. The new trial, carefully managed by royal officials, heard testimony from surviving witnesses and declared Joan innocent, a martyr killed by France's enemies. This rehabilitation helped establish the legitimacy of the Valois dynasty. Charles VII died on July 22, 1461, having reigned for nearly 40 years. He had inherited a divided kingdom on the verge of extinction and left a unified France with strengthened royal institutions. The transformation was remarkable, though how much credit belongs to Charles personally versus his able advisors remains debated. His reign proved that the Valois branch could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. Louis XV, who ruled from 1461 to 1483, was one of the most unusual kings in French history. Short, ungainly, and deliberately shabby in his dress, he looked more like a merchant than a monarch. He preferred the company of low-born advisors to nobles, lived simply, except for his passion for hunting, and conducted diplomacy through bribery and deception rather than war. His enemies called him the universal spider for the webs of intrigue he spun across Europe. Louis's character was shaped by his difficult relationship with his father and his years of exile in Burgundy. He had seen the failures of traditional chivalric monarchy and determined to rule differently. Where his predecessors had sought glory, Louis sought power. Where they had trusted nobles, Louis trusted only those completely dependent on him. His motto, "He who has succeeded has not lied," captured his purely pragmatic approach to kingship. The beginning of Louis's reign seemed to promise disaster. He immediately alienated the great nobles by dismissing his father's advisors and replacing them with his own men of humble origins. The League of the Public Weal, formed in 1465, united virtually all the great princes of France against him. The Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Brittany, the Duke of Bourbon, and even Louis's own brother Charles all joined the coalition, demanding the restoration of aristocratic privileges. The Battle of Montlhéry in July 1465 was technically indecisive, but strategically a defeat for Louis. Forced to negotiate with the rebels, he made extensive concessions, giving his brother the Duchy of Normandy and making other grants that seemed to fragment the kingdom. But Louis had no intention of keeping these agreements. Over the following years, he gradually undermined the League's unity, buying off some members, intimidating others, and waiting patiently for opportunities. Louis's greatest opponent was Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, from 1467 to 1477. Charles dreamed of creating a middle kingdom between France and Germany, reviving the old Lotharingian realm. He controlled not just Burgundy, but also the wealthy Low Countries, and his military power seemed superior to Louis's. The confrontation between the cautious, cunning Louis and the ambitious, aggressive Charles would determine whether France would survive as a unified kingdom. The meeting at Péronne in 1468 showed both Louis's audacity and his poor judgment. Believing he could negotiate with Charles, Louis placed himself in the Duke's power, essentially becoming his prisoner. When news arrived that Louis had encouraged a revolt in Liège against Burgundy, Charles was furious and might have killed or permanently imprisoned the king. Louis escaped by agreeing to humiliating terms and personally participating in the suppression of the Liège revolt he had encouraged. But Louis learned from his mistakes. He avoided direct military confrontation with Charles, instead using diplomacy to isolate Burgundy. He subsidized the Swiss who defeated Charles at Grandson and Morat in 1476. He encouraged René of Lorraine, who killed Charles at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. With Charles dead and leaving only a daughter, Mary, Louis moved quickly to seize Burgundy proper and other French territories, though Mary's marriage to Maximilian of Austria preserved the Low Countries for the Habsburgs. The destruction of Burgundian power was Louis's greatest achievement, removing the last great feudal principality that could challenge royal authority. But his methods in consolidating these gains showed his ruthless nature. The town of Arras, which resisted royal authority, was completely depopulated and resettled with loyal subjects. Noble conspirators were imprisoned in iron cages so small they could neither stand nor lie down, some remaining in these torture devices for years. Louis's administrative innovations were less dramatic than his father's, but equally important. He developed the postal system, establishing relay stations that allowed royal messages to travel rapidly across the realm. He promoted commerce and industry, protecting fairs and markets, establishing new industries and negotiating commercial treaties. The silk industry of Lyon, which would become one of France's most important industries, was established under his patronage. The king's religious life was complex and seemingly contradictory. He was genuinely devout, making pilgrimages and wearing religious medals, yet he used the church cynically for political ends. He negotiated the pragmatic sanction with the papacy, giving the crown effective control over church appointments in France. He collected holy relics obsessively, believing they would protect him from his enemies and extend his life. Louis's treatment of the nobility fundamentally changed the nature of the French aristocracy. He deliberately humiliated proud nobles, forcing them to accept his low-born favourites as equals. He broke up great feudal holdings, redistributing lands to create a nobility dependent on royal favour. The court, which under earlier kings had been a centre of chivalric culture, became under Louis a place of surveillance and control, where nobles were kept under the king's watchful eye. The expansion of royal justice under Louis XIII extended royal authority into every corner of the realm. The Parlement of Paris and regional parliaments heard appeals from seigneurial courts, gradually establishing the principle that all justice ultimately derived from the king. Louis personally involved himself in judicial matters, sometimes arriving unexpectedly at trials to ensure his will was done. His use of special commissions to try political cases bypassed normal judicial procedures, but effectively eliminated opposition. Louis's foreign policy was characterized by constant manoeuvring and opportunism. He supported the Lancastrians against the Yorkists in England's Wars of the Roses, then switched sides when advantageous. He intervened in Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, always seeking to weaken potential enemies and create dependencies. His pension list, paying regular bribes to foreign nobles and officials, was enormous but effective in purchasing influence. The king's personal life was austere except for his passion for hunting. He dressed in plain, often shabby clothes, earning mockery from foreign ambassadors. He ate simply and irregularly, often forgetting meals when absorbed in business. His marriage to Charlotte of Savoy produced children but little affection. He preferred the company of his barber, Oliver le Dame, whom he made a count, and his physician, Jacques Coictier, to that of nobles or even his own family. The final years of Louis's reign were marked by increasing paranoia and fear of death. He shut himself up in the castle of Plessis-les-Tours, surrounded by guards and traps. He paid enormous sums to physicians and astrologers who promised to extend his life. He brought holy men from across Europe, including Francis of Paula, hoping their prayers would save him. His fear of his son and heir, the future Charles VIII, led him to keep the young man virtually imprisoned and ignorant. Louis XVIII died on August 30th, 1483, aged 60. His death was welcomed by many who had suffered under his rule, yet his achievements were undeniable. He had broken the power of the great feudal nobles, doubled the royal domain, created an efficient administration, and made France the strongest power in Europe. His methods were cruel and duplicitous, but they succeeded where traditional kingship had failed. Charles VIII, who succeeded Louis XV at the age of 13, seemed the opposite of his father in every way. Where Louis had been calculating and cautious, Charles was impulsive and romantic. Where Louis had avoided war, Charles dreamed of military glory. His reign from 1483 to 1498, though brief, would initiate the Italian wars that would dominate European politics for 60 years and transform French culture through contact with the Italian Renaissance. The regency of Charles's sister Anne of Beaujeu from 1483 to 1491 provided stable government during his minority. Anne, intelligent and capable, maintained her father's policies while moderating his harshness. She successfully defeated the Mad War of 1485 to 1488, the last attempt by great nobles to assert independence from royal authority. The defeat and death of Francis II of Brittany led to the annexation of Brittany through Charles's marriage to Anne of Brittany, adding the last great independent duchy to the crown. Charles VIII's obsession with Italy stemmed from dynastic claims to the Kingdom of Naples through the Angevin inheritance. But beyond legal claims, Charles was captivated by medieval romances and dreams of crusade. He imagined conquering Naples, then using it as a base to recapture Constantinople and Jerusalem. These fantasies, absurd to modern eyes, were taken seriously by Charles and many contemporaries who still lived in a mental world shaped by chivalric literature. The Italian expedition of 1494-1495 was initially a stunning success. Charles's army, the finest in Europe with its Swiss infantry and advanced artillery, swept through Italy, meeting little resistance. Florence fell without a fight. Pope Alexander VI fled Rome. Naples was conquered in a matter of weeks. Charles entered Naples in triumph in February 1495, dressed as a Roman emperor. It seemed that French power was irresistible, but the conquest proved easier than holding the territory. A coalition, including the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, Venice, and Milan, formed against France. Charles's army, weakened by disease and with extended supply lines, had to fight its way back to France. The Battle of Fornovo in July 1495, though tactically a French victory, strategically meant the failure of the expedition. Within months of Charles's departure, French control of Naples collapsed. Charles VIII's death in 1498, hitting his head on a door lintel at Amboise Castle, ended his dreams of conquest. But the brief Italian expedition had profound consequences. The French nobility had seen the wealth and culture of Renaissance Italy. They brought back not just art and books, but ideas about government, architecture, and social life that would transform French culture. The Italian wars had begun, and they would continue with devastating consequences. Louis XIV, who succeeded as the nearest male heir, being the son of the poet Charles of Orleans, ruled from 1498 to 1515. Known as the Father of the People, for his concern for his subjects' welfare, Louis was a more capable ruler than Charles VIII, but equally obsessed with Italian conquests. His claims were even stronger, including not just Naples, but also Milan, through his grandmother, Valentina Visconti. Louis XIV's first Italian campaign in 1499 succeeded in conquering Milan, and for a time it seemed French dominance in northern Italy was established. But holding Milan proved as difficult as holding Naples. The Swiss, who had been French allies, turned against France when their pay was delayed. The papacy under the warrior Pope Julius II organised coalition after coalition against French power. Spain, now unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, emerged as France's primary rival. The Battle of Ravenna in 1512 showed both the power and limitations of French arms. The French won a brilliant tactical victory, with their artillery devastating the Spanish and Papal forces. But the death of the French commander Gaston de Foix and heavy French casualties made the victory Pyrrhic. Within months, the French were driven from Italy, and Swiss troops were raiding into France itself. The reign of Francis I from 1515 to 1547 marked the true arrival of the Renaissance in France. Francis was the embodiment of the Renaissance prince, tall, athletic, cultured, and magnificent. His court became the most brilliant in Europe, attracting artists, poets, and scholars. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years in France under Francis's patronage, dying in the king's arms, according to legend, though Francis was probably elsewhere. Francis's first Italian campaign began with the spectacular victory at Marignano in September 1515. The young king, aged 21, personally led his heavy cavalry in charges against the Swiss infantry, who had been considered invincible. The two-day battle was one of the bloodiest of the era, but French victory was complete. Francis was knighted on the battlefield by Bayard, the perfect knight, without fear and without reproach, in a scene that captured the blend of medieval and Renaissance values. The Concordat of Bologna in 1516 between Francis and Pope Leo X gave the French crown unprecedented control over the French church. The king gained the right to nominate bishops and abbots, effectively making the higher clergy royal servants. In return, the papacy received recognition of its spiritual authority and financial benefits. This agreement would govern church-state relations in France until the Revolution. But Francis's great rival was Charles V, who inherited Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Charles's domains surrounded France, and the struggle between Francis and Charles would dominate European politics for 30 years. Both monarchs claimed to be the leader of Christendom. Both sought dominance in Italy, and their personal rivalry added venom to political conflict. The Battle of Pavia on February 24, 1525, was the greatest disaster of Francis's reign. The French army was destroyed, much of the nobility killed, and Francis himself captured. His famous letter to his mother, "All is lost save honour," captured the chivalric values that still dominated French noble culture. Francis's captivity in Madrid, where he signed a humiliating treaty giving up Burgundy and his Italian claims, seemed to mark the end of French ambitions. But Francis repudiated the treaty as soon as he was released, claiming it was signed under duress. The wars continued, with France increasingly allying with the Ottoman Empire against Charles V, shocking Christian opinion, but reflecting pragmatic politics. The introduction of Ottoman pressure in the Mediterranean and Central Europe prevented Charles from concentrating his full power against France. The transformation of the French court under Francis III was remarkable. The medieval household became a Renaissance court modelled on Italian examples. The Château of Fontainebleau was rebuilt in Renaissance style, with Italian artists creating magnificent decorations. The Louvre began its transformation from fortress to palace. French nobles learned to appreciate art, literature, and refined manners, as well as military prowess. The development of French as a literary language accelerated under Francis. The Ordinance of Villers-Cotterêts in 1539 mandated the use of French rather than Latin in legal documents, a crucial step in linguistic unification. Poets of the Pléiade, led by Ronsard and Du Bellay, created a French literature that could rival Italian achievements. The Collège de France was founded to promote humanistic learning outside the conservative University of Paris. Francis's religious policy was contradictory, reflecting the tensions of the early Reformation. He protected humanists and reformers when it suited him, but also burned heretics when political necessity demanded. His sister Marguerite of Navarre protected Protestant sympathisers, while Francis allied with German Protestant princes against Charles fisted the affair of the placards in 1534, when Protestant posters appeared even on the king's bedroom door, led to severe persecution, showing the limits of royal tolerance. The reign of Henry II from 1547 to 1559 continued the Italian wars and Renaissance culture, but with less flair than his father. Henry was competent, but lacked Francis's charisma. His court was dominated by his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, 20 years his senior, and his wife Catherine de' Medici, who brought Italian sophistication and political cunning to France. The final phase of the Italian wars under Henry II saw some French successes, including the capture of Calais from England in 1558, ending their last foothold in France. But the Treaty of Cateau Cambrésis in 1559 essentially confirmed Spanish dominance in Italy. France retained some conquests, but abandoned its Italian ambitions after 65 years of almost continuous warfare that had drained the treasury and decimated the nobility. The death of Henry II in a tournament accident on July 10, 1559, celebrating the peace treaty, seemed like divine judgment on the wasteful wars. A lance splinter penetrated his eye and brain when jousting against Gabriel de Montgomery. The king lingered for 10 days in agony while the court watched in horror. His death left France with a 15-year-old king, Francis II, and would initiate 40 years of civil war that nearly destroyed the kingdom. Francis II's brief reign from 1559 to 1560 revealed the fragility of royal authority when the king was weak. The young king was sickly and completely dominated by his wife Mary Stuart's uncles, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine. The Guise family, claiming descent from Charlemagne, used their control of the king to pursue their own ambitions and to position themselves as champions of Catholicism against the growing Protestant movement. The Protestant Reformation had been spreading in France for decades despite royal persecution. By 1560, perhaps 10% of the population had converted to Calvinism, including many nobles and urban elites. These Huguenots, as French Protestants were called, represented a fundamental challenge, not just to religious orthodoxy, but to the entire social and political order. The monarchy's claim to sacred authority depended on Catholic theology, and religious division threatened political unity. The conspiracy of Amboise in March 1560 showed how quickly religious tension could become political rebellion. Protestant nobles attempted to kidnap Francis II and eliminate the Guise influence. The plot failed, and the repression was brutal, with dozens of conspirators hanged from the castle walls. But the conspiracy revealed the depth of Protestant organisation and determination. Religious war was becoming inevitable. The death of Francis II in December 1560 brought his 10-year-old brother Charles to the throne, with their mother Catherine de' Medici as regent. Catherine, one of history's most controversial figures, would dominate French politics for the next 30 years. Intelligent, cunning, and completely devoted to preserving her children's inheritance, she tried to maintain royal authority by balancing Catholic and Protestant factions. This politique approach, prioritizing political stability over religious orthodoxy, was pragmatic but satisfied no one. The Colloquy of Poissy in 1561, Catherine's attempt to reconcile Catholic and Protestant theology through dialogue, failed completely. The theological differences were irreconcilable, with Protestants rejecting transubstantiation and papal authority, while Catholics saw these as essential to salvation. The January Edict of 1562, granting Protestants limited freedom of worship, was meant as a compromise, but instead triggered violence from both sides. The massacre of Vassy on March 1st, 1562, where the Duke of Guise's troops killed dozens of Protestant worshippers, began the first of 8 wars of religion that would devastate France. These wars were exceptionally brutal, with both sides convinced they were doing God's work. Massacres, assassinations, and atrocities became common. Towns were besieged and sacked, churches destroyed, priests and pastors murdered. The kingdom seemed to be dissolving into chaos. The Battle of Dreux in December 1562 showed the military balance between the factions. Both sides claimed victory, both lost their commanders, captured or killed, and nothing was resolved. This pattern would repeat throughout the wars, bloody battles that changed nothing, followed by peace treaties that satisfied no one and were quickly broken. The wars were not just religious but also political, with great noble families using religion to pursue their ambitions. The Peace of Saint-Germain in 1570 seemed to offer hope for reconciliation. Admiral Coligny, the Protestant leader, gained influence over the young Charles Hathaway, encouraging him to assert independence from his mother and to unite France through war against Spain in the Netherlands. The marriage of the Protestant Henry of Navarre to the king's sister Marguerite was planned to symbolize religious reconciliation. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 24, 1572, destroyed any hope of peaceful coexistence. What began as a targeted assassination of Protestant leaders gathered in Paris for the royal wedding became a general massacre. For 3 days, Catholic mobs murdered Protestants throughout Paris. The violence spread to the provinces, where perhaps 10,000 more were killed over several weeks. The massacre shocked Europe and convinced Protestants that no accommodation with the monarchy was possible. Charles IX never recovered from the psychological trauma of the massacre. Whether he ordered it, was manipulated into it by his mother, or simply lost control remains debated. He died in 1574 at age 23, reportedly haunted by visions of the massacre's victims. His death brought his brother Henry III to the throne, the last Valois king who would face the complete breakdown of royal authority. Henry III, who ruled from 1574 to 1589, was perhaps the most intelligent and cultured of Catherine de' Medici's sons, but he faced impossible challenges. The kingdom was effectively divided into 3 parts: the royal domain, Protestant areas in the south and west, and Catholic League territories controlled by the Guise family. Royal authority had collapsed in many regions, with local strongmen ruling independently regardless of official allegiances. Henry III's personality became a political liability. His devotion to elaborate court ceremonies, his group of young male favourites called mignons, and his oscillation between extreme piety and decadent luxury alienated both Catholics and Protestants. Pamphlets portrayed him as effeminate, sexually deviant, and unfit to rule. Whether these accusations were true or politically motivated slander, they undermined royal prestige at a critical moment. The War of the Three Henrys, from 1585 to 1589, represented the complete breakdown of the French state. Henry III faced Henry of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir presumptive after the death of the king's last brother. Each claimed to represent legitimate authority, each controlled significant territory and military forces, and none could defeat the others decisively. The Day of the Barricades on May 12, 1588, showed how completely Henry III had lost control. The people of Paris, supporting the Catholic League, rose against the king, building barricades that trapped royal troops. Henry III was forced to flee his own capital, humiliated and powerless. The Guise faction controlled Paris and much of northern France, reducing the king to a figurehead. Henry III's assassination of the Duke of Guise and his brother the Cardinal of Guise at Blois in December 1588 was a desperate attempt to restore royal authority through murder. The king invited them to his chamber and had them killed by his guards. But rather than breaking the Catholic League, the murders enraged Catholics and led to Henry III being declared deposed by the Sorbonne theologians. The Pope excommunicated him, and much of Catholic France refused to recognise his authority. The alliance between Henry III and Henry of Navarre in 1589 was a last desperate measure. The Catholic king and the Protestant heir joined forces against the Catholic League, shocking contemporaries. Together, they besieged Paris, but on August 1st, 1589, Henry III was assassinated by Jacques Clément, a Dominican friar who saw himself as God's instrument. With his dying breath, Henry III recognized Henry of Navarre as his successor. Henry IV's accession in 1589 began the Bourbon dynasty, another branch of the Capetian tree, descending from Louis IX's son, Robert of Clermont. But Henry faced seemingly impossible challenges. As a Protestant, he was rejected by most Catholics, who comprised 90% of the population. The Catholic League controlled Paris and most major cities. Philip II of Spain, claiming to defend Catholicism, sent armies to support the League and advanced his own daughter's claim to the throne. Henry IV's military genius kept his cause alive during the early years. The Battle of Arques in 1589, and especially the Battle of Ivry in 1590, showed his tactical brilliance. At Ivry, Henry's famous cry, "Follow my white plume, you will find it on the path to victory and honour," became legendary. But military victories could not overcome religious opposition. His siege of Paris in 1590 failed when Spanish troops intervened, and the war dragged on inconclusively. The conversion of Henry IV to Catholicism on July 25, 1593, was the turning point. His supposed quip, "Paris is worth a mass, whether authentic or not," captured the pragmatic calculation behind the conversion. By becoming Catholic, Henry removed the main obstacle to his acceptance, while his Edict of Nantes would later protect Protestant rights. The conversion was probably sincere. Henry heard Mass daily for the rest of his life, but it was also politically essential. Paris opened its gates to Henry on March 22, 1594, and other cities quickly followed. The League collapsed, its leaders accepting generous terms from the king. Spanish forces were gradually expelled, and by 1598 the Treaty of Vervins ended foreign intervention. After 40 years of civil war, France was finally at peace under an undisputed king. The relief was palpable, and Henry's popularity soared. The Edict of Nantes, issued on April 13, 1598, was Henry's solution to religious division. It granted Protestants freedom of conscience, the right to worship in specified locations, access to education and public office, and even control of fortified towns for their security. Catholics were outraged by these concessions to heresy, while Protestants were disappointed by the restrictions. But the edict created a workable compromise that would maintain relative peace for nearly a century. Henry IV's domestic policies focused on rebuilding a kingdom devastated by war. His famous wish that every peasant should have a chicken in his pot on Sundays captured his concern for common people's welfare. With his minister Sully, Henry reformed finances, reduced corruption, and paid off massive royal debts. Roads and bridges were rebuilt, marshes drained, and agriculture encouraged. The king personally promoted the silk industry and other manufactures. The transformation of Paris under Henry IV was remarkable. The Place Royale, now Place des Vosges, became Europe's first planned square, a model of urban design. The Pont Neuf, despite its name meaning new bridge, has lasted over 400 years. The Louvre was expanded and connected to the Tuileries. Paris was becoming the magnificent capital that would dazzle Europe, though much work remained. Henry's foreign policy sought to limit Habsburg power without triggering another devastating war. He subsidized the Dutch revolt against Spain and the German Protestant princes against the emperor. He negotiated marriages for his children that would have long-term consequences. His daughter Elizabeth to the future Charles the Regent of England, his son Louis to Anne of Austria. These dynastic connections would shape European politics for generations. The assassination of Henry IV on May 14, 1610, by François Ravaillac, a Catholic fanatic, shocked France and Europe. Henry had been preparing for war against Spain, and many suspected Spanish involvement, though Ravaillac insisted he acted alone. The outpouring of grief was genuine and widespread. Henry had given France peace, prosperity, and hope after decades of horror. His death left a 9-year-old son, Louis XV, and another regency. The regency of Marie de' Medici from 1610 to 1617 squandered much of Henry IV's achievement. Marie, Henry's widow, was well-meaning but politically inept. She abandoned Henry's anti-Habsburg policy, arranging Spanish marriages for her children. She allowed Italian favourites, particularly Concino Concini, to dominate government and enrich themselves. The great nobles, suppressed under Henry, reasserted their independence. The young Louis XIII was a complex figure, intelligent but withdrawn, pious but harsh, devoted to justice but capable of cruelty. His seizure of power in 1617, arranging Concini's assassination and exiling his mother, showed unexpected determination. But Louis recognised his own limitations and his need for able ministers. His appointment of Cardinal Richelieu as chief minister in 1624 would transform French government and European politics. Richelieu, one of history's greatest statesmen, governed France from 1624 to 1642 with an iron hand. His goals were simple but revolutionary: to make the king supreme in France and France supreme in Europe. To achieve these goals, he would sacrifice anything and anyone. His famous statement that he had no enemies save those of the state captured his complete identification with royal power. The destruction of Protestant political power was Richelieu's first priority. The Huguenots' fortified towns were independent republics that challenged royal authority. The siege of La Rochelle from 1627 to 1628 was Richelieu's masterpiece. He built a dike across the harbour to prevent English relief, personally supervised the siege despite attempts on his life, and forced the city's surrender after 14 months. The Grace of Alais in 1629 destroyed Protestant fortifications while confirming religious freedom, eliminating political rebellion while avoiding religious war. Richelieu's assault on noble independence was equally systematic. Dueling was prohibited to stop nobles from killing each other outside royal justice. Castles were demolished unless needed for frontier defence. Noble conspiracies were crushed ruthlessly, with even the highest aristocrats executed for treason. The Day of Dupe in 1630, when Marie de' Medici tried to force Louis to dismiss Richelieu, ended with the Queen Mother's exile and Richelieu more powerful than ever. The administrative centralisation under Richelieu transformed French government. Intendants, royal officials with extensive powers, were sent to every province to enforce royal will over local authorities. These middle-class lawyers and administrators, completely dependent on royal favour, broke the power of provincial nobles and parliaments. The modern centralised French state was taking shape. Richelieu's foreign policy seemed contradictory, but was brilliantly consistent. Though a cardinal of the Catholic Church, he allied with Protestant powers against the Catholic Habsburgs. French subsidies kept the 30 Years' War going, bleeding Habsburg power. French intervention from 1635 was carefully timed to prevent either Habsburg victory or total collapse. The goal was not religious but political, to break Habsburg encirclement of France. The cultural achievements under Richelieu were equally significant. The Académie Française, founded in 1635, standardised the French language and promoted literature. The Cardinal, himself a playwright, patronised artists and writers. The rebuilding of the Sorbonne and the Palais Cardinal, later Palais Royal, showed architectural ambition. French culture was becoming a model for Europe, a soft power complementing military strength. Louis XIII's death on May 14, 1643, exactly 33 years after his father's assassination, left another child king. Louis XIV was only 4 years old, and another regency seemed to threaten everything Richelieu had achieved. The cardinal had died just months earlier, and many expected the governmental system he created to collapse. Instead, it would reach its apogee under the Sun King. The regency of Anne of Austria, from 1643 to 1651, confounded expectations. The Spanish-born queen, long suspected of disloyalty, proved a capable regent. Her choice of Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's protégé, as chief minister ensured continuity. Mazarin, an Italian-born diplomat, lacked Richelieu's commanding presence, but possessed even greater diplomatic skill. Together, they would preserve royal authority through the last great noble rebellion. The Fronde, the civil war from 1648 to 1653, was the nobility's final attempt to reverse the growth of royal absolutism. Named after the slings used by street children, it began as a parliamentary protest against taxation, but escalated into armed rebellion. The Parlement of Paris, great nobles, and even princes of the blood united against Mazarin and royal authority. For a time, it seemed the English scenario, where Parliament had executed Charles V in 1649, might repeat in France. The young Louis XIV's experiences during the Fronde shaped his entire approach to kingship. He endured poverty when the court fled Paris, humiliation when mobs invaded his bedroom to verify he hadn't escaped, and fear when noble armies threatened his throne. He learned to hide his feelings behind a mask of royal dignity, to trust no one completely, and to see any limitation on royal power as potentially fatal. The absolute monarchy he would create was a response to the chaos he witnessed as a child. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, marked France's emergence as Europe's dominant power. France gained Alsace and other territories. The Habsburgs were permanently weakened, and the Holy Roman Empire fragmented into powerlessness. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659, ending war with Spain, confirmed French supremacy. Spain ceded territories and agreed to Louis XIV's marriage to the Infanta Maria Teresa, a union that would later justify French claims to the Spanish succession. Louis XIV's personal rule, beginning with Mazarin's death in 1661, shocked contemporaries. The 22-year-old king announced he would be his own chief minister, governing personally without a principal advisor. Nobles who asked to whom they should address matters were told, "To me." This declaration of personal rule was not mere posturing. For the next 54 years, Louis would work 8 hours daily at the business of government, reading dispatches, presiding over councils, and making every significant decision. The arrest of Nicolas Fouquet, the wealthy finance minister, in 1661 demonstrated Louis's determination to be master. Fouquet's magnificent chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte, which outshone royal residences, sealed his fate. His arrest, trial, and life imprisonment warned all subjects that none could rival the king. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who replaced Fouquet, understood that his role was to serve, not to rule. Colbert's economic reforms from 1661 to 1683 transformed French finances and commerce. Mercantilist policies promoted French manufacturing, protected by high tariffs. The Manufacture des Gobelins produced luxury goods that became synonymous with French quality. Overseas trading companies, though less successful than Dutch or English equivalents, expanded French commerce. Infrastructure improvements, including the Canal du Midi connecting the Atlantic and Mediterranean, facilitated trade. State finances, honestly administered for once, showed surpluses that funded Louis's ambitions. The construction of Versailles, beginning in the 1660s and continuing throughout the reign, was more than architectural extravagance. The palace, built on the site of Louis XV's hunting lodge, became the physical embodiment of absolute monarchy. Every detail, from the Hall of Mirrors reflecting the king's glory to the gardens imposing geometric order on nature, proclaimed royal power. The cost was enormous. perhaps 100 million livres, but the political impact was priceless. Life at Versailles was political theatre with Louis as producer, director and star. The elaborate daily ceremonies, from the king's rising to his retiring, transformed routine into ritual. Nobles who had once rebelled now competed for the honour of holding the king's shirt or candlestick. The court, with thousands of nobles in attendance, became a golden cage where aristocrats exchanged political power for proximity to royal magnificence. The king's famous statement, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, was not boastful but factual. Louis's religious policy reflected his belief that unity of faith was essential to political unity. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 ended Protestant rights, forcing conversions or exile. Perhaps 200,000 Huguenots fled, taking valuable skills to France's enemies. The decision was popular with Catholics, but economically and diplomatically disastrous. Protestant Europe united against French aggression, and France lost many of its most productive citizens. The wars of Louis XIV demonstrated both French power and its limits. The War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668, claiming the Spanish Netherlands through his wife's inheritance, showed European alarm at French expansion. The Dutch War, 1672 to 1678, began with spectacular victories, with French armies reaching the gates of Amsterdam, but ended with modest gains after a European coalition formed against France. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, saw France fighting virtually all Europe simultaneously. Military innovations under Louis XIV revolutionized warfare. Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, the great military engineer, designed fortifications that made French frontiers nearly impregnable. His system of parallel trenches for siege warfare became standard military practice. The French army, uniformed, drilled and disciplined, became the model for Europe. At its peak, Louis commanded 400,000 men, the largest military force seen in Europe since Rome. The cultural dominance of Louis XIV's France was as complete as its military power. French became the language of European elites, spoken in courts from Stockholm to Naples. French fashion, cuisine and manners set the standard for civilized life. Molière's comedies, Racine's tragedies and La Fontaine's fables created a classical French literature. Lully's operas and ballets, often featuring Louis himself as a dancer in his younger years, established French musical style. The War of the Spanish Succession, from 1701 to 1714, was Louis's greatest challenge and near catastrophe. When the childless Charles II of Spain died in 1700, he left his entire inheritance to Louis's grandson Philip. Louis's acceptance, despite previous agreements to partition Spain, united Europe against France once more. The war featured the military genius of the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene, who inflicted crushing defeats on French armies at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde and Malplaquet. By 1709, France faced complete defeat. The treasury was empty, the army demoralised, and famine stalked the land after the terrible winter of 1708-1709. Louis, now 70, offered to abdicate if it would bring peace. But the Allies' excessive demands, requiring Louis to use French armies to expel his own grandson from Spain, proved too much. French patriotism rallied, and the Battle of Denain in 1712 saved France from invasion. The treaties of Utrecht 1713 and Rastatt 1714 ended the war with compromise. Philip kept Spain but renounced claims to France, preventing the union of the two crowns. France retained most of its territory, but was exhausted financially and demographically. The war had cost perhaps 600,000 French lives and left debts that would burden the monarchy until its fall. The final years of Louis XIV's reign were marked by personal tragedy and national exhaustion. His son, grandson, and great-grandson, died within 3 years, leaving only a 2-year-old great-great-grandson as heir. The court, once brilliant, became sombre and devout under the influence of Madame de Maintenon, whom Louis had secretly married. The king who had danced as Apollo now spent his time in religious devotions and regrets. Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, after reigning 72 years, the longest recorded reign in European history. His deathbed advice to his heir warned against his own mistakes. "Do not imitate me in my love of building or my love of war." The Grand Siècle was over, leaving France culturally dominant but financially ruined, territorially intact but diplomatically isolated, administratively centralised but socially divided. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans from 1715 to 1723 marked a dramatic reversal of Louis XIV's policies. The regent, Louis XIV's nephew, was intelligent, cultured, and debauched. The court returned to Paris from Versailles, and the strict morality of Louis's final years gave way to notorious licence. The regent's suppers became legendary for their debauchery, while his patronage of arts and sciences showed genuine intellectual sophistication. The financial crisis inherited from Louis XIV demanded radical solutions. John Law, a Scottish economist and gambler, convinced the regent to adopt a revolutionary system based on paper money and colonial development. The Mississippi Company, granted monopolies on French colonial trade, saw its shares rise from 500 to 20,000 livres in months. The speculative bubble created fortunes overnight, with servants becoming millionaires and nobles scrambling for shares. The collapse of Law's system in 1720 was catastrophic. When investors tried to convert paper profits to gold, the scheme collapsed. Riots erupted in Paris, fortunes evaporated, and paper money became worthless. The financial trauma would make the French monarchy resistant to financial innovation precisely when it needed it most. Public confidence in royal finances, already weak, was destroyed. Louis XV's personal rule began in 1723, when he reached his majority at 13. The young king was handsome, intelligent, and initially popular, called the Well-Beloved, but his character, shaped by early orphaning and the regency's licence, proved unsuited to kingship. Shy, indecisive, and increasingly devoted to pleasure rather than governance, Louis would preside over the monarchy's slow decline, while perceiving the problems but lacking will to address them. Cardinal Fleury's ministry from 1726 to 1743 provided a final period of effective government. The elderly cardinal, Louis's tutor, governed with wisdom and economy. He avoided expensive wars, balanced budgets, and promoted commerce. French trade quadrupled, colonial empire expanded, and prosperity returned. But Fleury could not address fundamental problems: the nobility and clergy's tax exemptions, the Parliament's obstruction, and the monarchy's structural financial weakness. The War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 showed French military power remained formidable. Marshal de Saxe's victory at Fontenoy in 1745 was the last great triumph of the French monarchy. Louis XIV, present at the battle, was cheered as a hero, but the peace of Aix-la-Chapelle returned all conquests, leading to the bitter saying that France fought for the King of Prussia, military glory no longer translated to territorial gain. The influence of Madame de Pompadour from 1745 to 1764 marked a new phase in royal governance. The brilliant bourgeoise, elevated to be royal mistress and later friend, effectively governed France for 2 decades. Her patronage of Enlightenment philosophers, protection of the encyclopédie, and promotion of arts showed cultural sophistication. But her influence on policy, particularly the disastrous 7 Years' War, damaged royal prestige. A king ruled by his mistress seemed contemptible to many subjects. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was catastrophic for French prestige and power. Despite alliance with Austria, Russia, and Spain, France was defeated by Britain and Prussia. In India, Clive's victories destroyed French influence. In North America, Wolfe's capture of Quebec ended New France. The Treaty of Paris saw France lose Canada, Louisiana, and most of India. The First Global War had been decisively lost, and British supremacy established. The expulsion of the Jesuits in 1764 showed the monarchy's weakness against the Parlement. The Jesuits, supporters of royal authority and Catholic orthodoxy, were destroyed by an alliance of Jansenists, philosophes, and parliamentary magistrates. Louis XV, pressured from all sides, sacrificed the order. The Pope's suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, forced by Bourbon monarchs, showed how weak traditional authorities had become. The conflict with the Parliament intensified throughout Louis XIV's reign. These law courts, particularly the Parliament of Paris, claimed to represent the nation against royal despotism. They refused to register royal edicts, particularly tax reforms, that would have ended noble exemptions. The exile of the Paris Parlement in 1771 by Chancellor Maupeou seemed to break their power, but the reform came too late and would be reversed under Louis XVI. The intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment undermined the ideological foundations of absolute monarchy. Voltaire mocked religious intolerance and arbitrary power. Rousseau's social contract argued sovereignty belonged to the people, not kings. The Encyclopédie spread scientific rationalism and critical thinking. The philosophes, often patronized by the very elites they criticized, created an intellectual climate hostile to traditional authority. The death of Louis XV on May 10, 1774, from smallpox was unmourned. His funeral procession travelled at night to avoid hostile demonstrations. His reign of 59 years had seen France decline from European dominance to second-rate status. The monarchy's prestige was shattered, its finances ruined, its authority questioned. His great-great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, inherited an impossible situation. Louis XVI, aged 19 at his accession, was personally virtuous but politically incompetent. Shy, indecisive, and more interested in locksmithing than statecraft, he was dominated by his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette. His genuine desire for reform was undermined by inability to confront vested interests. His restoration of the parliaments, reversing Maupeou's reforms, was politically popular, but financially disastrous. The appointment of Jacques Turgot as Controller General in 1774 offered hope for reform. Turgot, a philosophe and economist, attempted to liberalise the economy, ending guilds and corvée labour. His 6 edicts would have transformed France's economy. But opposition from nobles, clergy, parliaments, and even the Queen forced his dismissal in 1776. The best chance for peaceful reform had passed. French intervention in the American Revolution from 1708 to 1783 was the monarchy's final triumph and fatal mistake. Motivated by revenge against Britain, France provided money, arms, and military force that ensured American independence. Lafayette and Rochambeau became heroes, and Yorktown avenged the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. But the war cost over 1 billion livres, doubling the national debt. More dangerously, French officers and soldiers returned infected with revolutionary ideas. They had fought for liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty in America. These concepts, incompatible with absolute monarchy, spread through French society. The American example proved that enlightened ideals could create functioning governments. The Bourbon monarchy had financed its own ideological destruction. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 destroyed what remained of royal prestige. Though Marie Antoinette was innocent of stealing the necklace, public opinion convicted her. The image of a spendthrift, immoral queen squandering France's wealth while people starved became fixed. Pamphlets portrayed the royal family in pornographic scenarios. The sacred aura of monarchy, carefully cultivated for centuries, evaporated in ridicule and contempt. The Assembly of Notables in 1787, called to approve new taxes, instead demanded the calling of the Estates General, which had not met since 1614. The nobles and clergy, defending their tax exemptions, used liberal rhetoric about consent and representation. They thought they could control reform to their advantage. Instead, they had opened the floodgates of revolution. The calling of the Estates General for May 1789 transformed political discussion across France. For the first time in 175 years, the nation would speak to its king through elected representatives. The Cahiers de Doléances, lists of grievances drawn up by each estate in each district, revealed the depth of France's crisis. Peasants demanded abolition of feudal dues, bourgeois wanted careers open to talent, nobles sought to limit royal power, and all agreed the financial system needed complete reform. The elections themselves revolutionized political consciousness. In thousands of assemblies across France, ordinary men discussed fundamental questions of government, justice, and society. Pamphlets proliferated, with Abbé Sieyès' "What is the Third Estate?" providing the revolutionary answer: everything. The Third Estate, representing 98% of the population, should no longer accept subordination to the privileged orders. The opening of the Estates General at Versailles on May 5, 1789, revealed the monarchy's fatal indecision. Should the three estates vote separately, ensuring noble and clerical veto over reform, or together, giving the Third Estate effective control? Louis XVI and his ministers had no clear plan, allowing the situation to drift toward confrontation. The Third Estate, reinforced by liberal nobles and clergy, declared itself the National Assembly on June 17th. The tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789, marked the point of no return. Locked out of their meeting hall, the National Assembly gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore not to disperse until France had a constitution. This assertion of popular sovereignty against royal authority was revolutionary. Louis XVII's belated attempt to assert control at the royal session of June 23rd failed when the Third Estate refused to disperse. "We are here by the will of the people," declared Mirabeau, "and will leave only at the point of bayonets." The king's concentration of troops around Paris and Versailles in early July suggested a military coup against the Assembly. The dismissal of Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister, on July 11th triggered uprising in Paris. Crowds searched for arms to defend the revolution, leading to the assault on the Bastille on July 14th. The fortress prison, symbol of arbitrary royal power, fell to the people. Its governor was killed, his head paraded on a pike. The revolution had claimed its first victims. The great fear that swept rural France in late July 1789 showed the collapse of royal authority. Peasants, believing aristocrats were hiring brigands to destroy the harvest, attacked chateaux and burned feudal documents. The National Assembly, terrified of complete social breakdown, acted decisively. On the night of August 4th, noble and clerical deputies renounced their privileges in an extraordinary session of patriotic fervour. Feudalism, the social system that had defined France for 1,000 years, was abolished in principle. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted August 26, 1789, proclaimed principles incompatible with traditional monarchy. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Law is the expression of the general will. These were not reforms, but a revolution in the conception of government and society. The old regime was not being modified but replaced. The October days of 1789 brought the revolution to the royal family directly. Parisian market women angry about bread prices, marched to Versailles, demanding the king return to Paris. The palace was invaded, guards killed, and the royal family forced to accompany the crowd back to the capital. Installed in the Tuileries Palace, they were effectively prisoners. The magnificent isolation of Versailles, which had protected the monarchy from popular pressure, was over. The civil constitution of the clergy, enacted in July 1790, created a schism that would poison French politics for generations. The revolutionary government nationalised church property, made clergy elected civil servants, and required an oath of loyalty to the constitution. Pope Pius VI condemned these measures, forcing Catholics to choose between revolution and religion. Louis XVI, genuinely devout, was tormented by this conflict between his constitutional role and religious conscience. The flight to Varennes on June 21, 1791, destroyed what remained of Louis XVI's credibility. The royal family's attempt to escape France, probably to return with Austrian armies, was stopped at Varennes near the border. Their humiliating return to Paris under guard showed the king as either a traitor conspiring with foreign enemies or a prisoner of revolutionary extremists. Either interpretation made constitutional monarchy impossible. The fiction that the king had been kidnapped, maintained briefly by the embarrassed assembly, fooled no one. Trust between monarch and nation was irreparably broken. The massacre at the Champ de Mars on July 17, 1791, showed the revolution dividing against itself. Republicans, led by the Cordeliers, and radical Jacobins demanded the king's deposition after Varennes. When they gathered peacefully to sign a petition, Lafayette's National Guard opened fire, killing perhaps 50 people. The split between constitutional monarchists and republicans would widen into civil war. The revolution was devouring its own children. The Legislative Assembly that met in October 1791 faced an impossible situation. The Constitution of 1791 created a constitutional monarchy with a king who clearly opposed it. War fever was rising, with revolutionaries believing conflict would expose traitors and spread liberty across Europe. The king and queen secretly hoped war would bring Austrian and Prussian armies to restore their authority. Only a few voices, like Robespierre's, warned that war would militarize the revolution and create dictatorship. The declaration of war against Austria on April 20, 1792, began 23 years of almost continuous European conflict. The initial French defeats seemed to confirm royalist hopes and revolutionary fears. Prussian and Austrian armies advanced while French forces fled in panic. The Duke of Brunswick's manifesto, threatening Paris with destruction if the royal family was harmed, proved counterproductive. Rather than intimidating revolutionaries, it convinced them that the king was conspiring with enemies. The storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792, ended the monarchy in all but name. Swiss guards defending the palace were massacred after the king ordered them to cease fire. The royal family fled to the Legislative Assembly for protection, but found themselves prisoners instead. The Paris Commune, controlled by radical sans-culottes, now wielded real power. The monarchy that had ruled France for 800 years was suspended, though not yet formally abolished. The September massacres of 1792 revealed the revolution's descent into terror. As Prussian armies advanced toward Paris, rumours spread that prisoners would break out and join the invaders. Mobs invaded prisons and murdered over 1,000 inmates, including common criminals, priests and aristocrats. The Princess de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's friend, was literally torn to pieces. Her head paraded past the Queen's window. These spontaneous massacres prefigured the organised terror to come. The Battle of Valmy on September 20, 1792, saved the revolution and doomed the monarchy. The cannonade that stopped the Prussian advance was militarily minor but psychologically decisive. The citizen army had held against professional soldiers. Goethe, present with the Prussian army, supposedly said, "From this place and this day forth begins a new era in world history." The next day, the newly assembled National Convention abolished monarchy and proclaimed the Republic. The trial of Louis XVI from December 1792 to January 1793 was political theatre with a predetermined outcome. The discovery of the king's secret correspondence in an iron chest, including evidence of counter-revolutionary plotting, sealed his fate. The debates were less about guilt, which was obvious, than about punishment. The Girondins sought to save the king through appeal to the people or exile. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre and Saint-Just, demanded death. "Louis must die so that the nation may live," declared Robespierre. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, at the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, was a moment of irreversible transformation. The king died with dignity, attempting a final speech drowned out by drums. His severed head was shown to the crowd, some of whom rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in royal blood. Regicide was not new in European history, but the formal trial and public execution of an anointed king by his own subjects was revolutionary. Every crowned head in Europe now knew that revolution threatened not just their thrones, but their lives. Marie Antoinette's execution on October 16, 1793, completed the destruction of the royal family. After months of harsh imprisonment, separated from her surviving children, she faced trial on charges including treason and, grotesquely, incest with her son. She maintained dignity despite deliberate humiliation, riding to the scaffold in an open cart rather than the closed carriage allowed her husband. Her last words, stepping on the executioner's foot, were reportedly, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." The Austrian princess, who had come to France as a symbol of alliance, died as a symbol of aristocratic corruption. The fate of Louis XVI, the young Dauphin, remains one of history's mysteries. The 8-year-old boy, proclaimed king by royalists after his father's execution, endured horrible treatment in prison. Separated from his mother and aunt, he was deliberately corrupted and neglected by his revolutionary guardians. He died in prison on June 8, 1795, at age 10, probably from tuberculosis exacerbated by abuse. Rumours that he escaped and was replaced by another child persisted for decades, with numerous pretenders claiming to be the lost king. The execution of other Capetian princes showed the revolution's determination to exterminate royal blood. Louis XVIII's brother, the Count of Provence, escaped to become Louis XIV, but their cousin, Philippe Égalité, Duke of Orléans, who had voted for Louis XVI's death, discovered that revolutionary credentials could not save royal blood. He was guillotined in November 1793. His son, the future King Louis Philippe, survived only by fleeing France. The Thermidorian reaction of July 1794, ending the terror with Robespierre's fall, did not restore monarchy but created space for royalist resurgence. The Directory, established in 1795, faced constant royalist conspiracies. Elections in 1797 showed significant royalist strength before being annulled by military coup. The White Terror in the south saw royalists massacring republicans. The Vendée region remained in sporadic revolt, its peasant armies fighting for God and king against the godless republic. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power from 1799 seemed to end royalist hopes. The Corsican general, who had crushed royalist uprising with a whiff of grape shot in 1795, established a regime that combined revolutionary principles with autocratic practice. His concordat with the Pope restored Catholicism without restoring church lands. His civil code enshrined legal equality while creating a new aristocracy. His empire seemed to have replaced the Capetian monarchy permanently. Yet Napoleon's relationship with monarchy was complex. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, Marie Antoinette's grandniece, seeking legitimacy through royal connection. He created a new nobility with imperial titles. Most significantly, he demonstrated that France needed strong executive authority, preparing the ground for eventual royal restoration. His defeat and exile in 1814 created the opportunity for the Bourbon restoration that had seemed impossible just years before. The restoration of Louis XVI in 1814 might have seemed to vindicate the principle of legitimacy and divine right that had sustained the Capetian dynasty for 8 centuries. The brother of the executed Louis XVI returned to a France exhausted by 25 years of revolution and war, promising reconciliation and constitutional monarchy. The white flag of the Bourbons replaced the revolutionary tricolour, and the fiction was maintained that Louis was in the 19th year of his reign, as if the revolution had never happened. But the restoration could not restore the world that had produced the Capetian monarchy. The sale of church and noble lands had created millions of new property owners who would never accept a return to feudalism. The idea of legal equality, however imperfectly realised, had taken root too deeply to be extracted. The experience of popular sovereignty, however chaotic, had demonstrated that legitimate government required some form of consent from the governed. The Restoration was less a return to the past than an attempt to reconcile monarchy with modernity. The reign of Charles X from 1824 to 1830 showed the impossibility of true restoration. The last Bourbon king, who had been Count of Artois and leader of the ultra-royalists, attempted to revive the sacred monarchy of his ancestors. His elaborate coronation at Reims, complete with the traditional ceremonies, including touching for scrofula, seemed anachronistic to a generation that had known Napoleon. His compensation of émigrés for lost lands, his support for clerical control of education, and his restriction of press freedom alienated the bourgeoisie who had become France's dominant class. The July Revolution of 1830 took just 3 days to overthrow a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The 3 glorious days of street fighting in Paris showed how fragile the restored monarchy was. Charles X's abdication and flight to England ended the senior Bourbon line's rule forever. The ease of the revolution demonstrated that divine right monarchy was dead in France, killed not by revolutionary extremism, but by its own inability to adapt to a changed world. The July monarchy of Louis Philippe from 1830 to 1848 represented a different model of kingship. The Duke of Orleans from the Cadet Bourbon line became King of the French rather than King of France, a crucial distinction implying that his authority came from the people rather than God. The bourgeois king, who carried an umbrella and sent his sons to public school, seemed to embody the juste milieu, the happy medium between revolution and reaction. But Louis Philippe's reign showed that monarchy itself, not just its particular form, had become problematic in post-revolutionary France. Despite his moderation and constitutional correctness, he faced constant challenges from Republicans who saw any king as illegitimate and legitimists who saw him as a usurper. The Revolution of 1848, triggered by economic crisis and political frustration, swept away the July monarchy as easily as 1830 had eliminated the Restoration. The Second Republic's transformation into the Second Empire under Napoleon III from 1852 to 1870 showed the continuing appeal of monarchical forms, if not legitimacy. The nephew of Napoleon III established a regime that combined plebiscitary democracy with imperial authority, modernization with tradition, the rhetoric of popular sovereignty with the practice of personal rule. His reign saw the transformation of Paris under Baron Haussmann, the expansion of railways and industry, and the brief restoration of French military glory. The collapse of the Second Empire at Sedan in 1870, with Napoleon III's capture by Prussian forces, ended the last attempt at monarchical government in France. The Third Republic, proclaimed on September 4, 1870, would last until 1940. Though royalists nearly succeeded in restoring monarchy in the 1870s, the Count of Chambord's refusal to accept the tricolour flag doomed their efforts. His insistence on the white flag of the Bourbons showed that legitimist monarchy had learned nothing from revolution. The death of the Count of Chambord in 1883, ending the senior Bourbon line, and of the Count of Paris in 1894, ending the Orléans line's immediate hopes, marked the effective end of monarchist politics in France. Though pretenders continued to claim the non-existent throne, and small groups of royalists maintained the tradition, monarchy had become a historical curiosity rather than a political possibility. The Capetian dynasty that had created France had become irrelevant to the nation it had shaped. Yet the Capetian legacy extends far beyond the dynasty's political fate. The administrative centralization created by Philip Augustus and perfected by Louis XIV remains characteristic of French government. The cultural prestige established by St. Louis and magnified by the Sun, King still makes French culture influential worldwide. The territorial boundaries established through 8 centuries of patient expansion, though modified, essentially define modern France. The French language, standardized and promoted by Capetian kings, remains a major world language. The legal traditions established by Capetian monarchs profoundly influenced modern law. The concept of the state as an abstract entity separate from the person of the ruler, developed by Capetian legists, became fundamental to modern political thought. The idea that sovereignty is indivisible, articulated to defend royal power, ironically became the basis for republican theories of popular sovereignty. The Napoleonic Code, which governs civil law in much of the world, built upon centuries of royal legal development. The architectural monuments of Capetian France remain among humanity's greatest achievements. Notre-Dame de Paris, begun under Louis VII, the Sainte-Chapelle of St. Louis, the Louvre expanded by successive kings, and Versailles, the ultimate expression of royal magnificence, continue to inspire awe. These buildings are not mere tourist attractions, but embodiments of a civilization's highest aspirations, testimonies to the power of human creativity when mobilized by royal patronage. The religious legacy of the Capetians shaped not only France but global Catholicism. The Gallican tradition of national church autonomy, developed through centuries of conflict between kings and popes, influenced church-state relations worldwide. The model of Catholic monarchy, with the king as eldest son of the church, provided a template for Catholic rulers from Spain to Poland. The canonization of Louis IX gave the French monarchy a sacred status that influenced political thought long after the monarchy's fall. The intellectual and cultural flowering under Capetian patronage created lasting achievements. The University of Paris, protected and promoted by Capetian kings, became the model for universities worldwide. The literary works produced at Capetian courts, from the Chanson de Geste to the classical dramas of Racine and Molière, remain central to world literature. The ideal of refinement and civilization associated with French culture originated in Capetian courts. The concept of the nation itself, as understood in the modern world, owes much to the Capetian achievement. The transformation of a feudal agglomeration into a unified state with common law, language, and identity provided a model for national development. The idea that a nation is not just a territory or population, but a community with shared history and destiny was first fully realized in Capetian France. The tragic end of the Capetian monarchy also provided lasting lessons. The failure to reform in time, the resistance to necessary change, and the ultimate explosion of revolutionary violence became a cautionary tale for rulers worldwide. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette shocked contemporaries into recognizing that traditional authority could not survive without adaptation. The French Revolution, made possible by Capetian centralization but directed against Capetian absolutism, changed political thought forever. Modern France, whether consciously or not, remains shaped by its Capetian past. The President of the Republic, residing in the Élysée Palace, exercises powers that would be familiar to Louis XIV. The prefects governing departments are direct descendants of royal intendants. The assumption that the state should direct economic development, provide cultural leadership, and embody national grandeur reflects Capetian traditions. Even Republican France cannot escape its royal heritage. The diaspora of Capetian influence extended far beyond France. Capetian princes ruled in Naples, Hungary, Poland, and Spain. The Bourbon dynasty still reigns in Spain and Luxembourg. The Portuguese and Brazilian royal houses descended from the Capetians. Through conquest, marriage, and cultural influence, Capetian ideas about monarchy, law, and culture spread across Europe and beyond. The study of the Capetian dynasty illuminates fundamental questions about political authority, social organization, and historical change. How does political legitimacy develop and decay? What is the relationship between power and culture? How do institutions evolve over centuries? Why do some political systems adapt while others collapse? The 1,000-year history of the Capetians provides rich material for understanding these enduring questions. The transformation from Hugh Capet's weak elective monarchy to Louis XIV's absolutism to Louis XV's execution traces the full arc of monarchical possibility. Each stage seemed permanent to contemporaries, but proved transitional in historical perspective. The dynasty that seemed divinely ordained to rule forever disappeared into history, leaving behind a transformed nation that both celebrates and repudiates its royal past. The personal dimensions of Capetian history remind us that great historical forces work through individual human beings. The piety of St. Louis, the cunning of Philip Augustus, the magnificence of Francis I, and the weakness of Louis XVI were not just personal characteristics, but historical forces that shaped millions of lives. The decisions made in royal councils, the marriages arranged for dynastic advantage, and the wars fought for royal glory had consequences that rippled across centuries. The women of the Capetian dynasty, though often marginalized in traditional histories, played crucial roles. Blanche of Castile's regency preserved the kingdom for St. Louis. Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages and divorces reshaped the political map of Europe. Catherine de' Medici's attempts to preserve her son's inheritance unleashed religious war. Marie Antoinette became a symbol that helped destroy the monarchy she represented. These women were not merely decorative figures, but active participants in the dynasty's rise and fall. The economic transformations under Capetian rule laid foundations for modern capitalism. The great fairs of Champagne, protected by royal authority, created international commercial networks. The development of Paris as a commercial and financial centre under royal patronage made it one of Europe's great cities. The mercantilist policies of Colbert, though ultimately unsuccessful, represented early attempts at national economic planning. Even the financial crises that destroyed the monarchy arose from the costs of creating a modern state. The military evolution under the Capetians traced the development of European warfare. From the feudal hosts of Hugh Capet to the professional armies of Charles VII to the mass conscription that saved the revolution, French military innovation repeatedly transformed warfare. The fortifications of Vauban, the artillery of the Bureau brothers, and the tactical innovations of great captains from Philip Augustus to Napoleon, built upon Capetian foundations.